Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Brad Mussel, and welcome to episode 12 of Book Musings. In this episode, I'll take a look at Terence McKenna's Food of the Gods, subtitled The Search for the Original Tree of Knowledge, further subtitled A Radical History of Plants, Drugs, and Human Evolution. So, as I typically do in these episodes, I'll begin the episode by offering a brief background, talking a little bit about why it is or how it was that I came to read Mr. McKenna's book. I'll then get into an account of what the book actually suggests, and as opposed to the previous episode, episode 11, where I took a look at Stephen King's It, in this episode, I'm going to offer a very extensive, deep dive into what McKenna's saying in this book, because as opposed to It by Stephen King, there's not a lot, at least I can't find a lot on Food of the Gods, whereas It, you can encounter all kinds of summaries of what goes down in the novel. Again, that doesn't seem to be the case for Terence McKenna's Food of the Gods. And so this episode is going to be rather extensive as a result. So, I will sort of follow he divides the book up into 4 parts. And so I will follow his lead in terms of that and sort of go in order and discuss what he talks about in each of those parts sequentially. Then, as I always do, I'll offer my thoughts or my musings on what McKenna has to say. One of the things that'll come out in the background is that this episode has been a long time in the making. I actually finished it 3 months ago, and so in view of that, or as a result of that, I have quite a few reflections. I've thought a lot about it. Had a lot of time to sort of stew over what he has to say, and so have quite a few thoughts, which again I'll share with you after I get into what the book's actually about. I'll start with my philosophical reflections, and I'll offer my more general musings about the book. Then I'll get into what my book musings grade is. So will it make the highly coveted Book Musings Hall of Fame, and perhaps even the top shelf of the Book Musings Hall of Fame? We shall see. It's certainly a fascinating and unique book, and uniqueness always is a plus for me, so maybe that foreshadows a little bit what I think of it, but we shall see, exactly what kind of grade I give it in the Book Musings grade section. And then I'll end, as I always do, by discussing what's potentially on tap for me, talking a little bit about what's of interest to me lately in terms of books I'm reading and so on. So again, this is going to be quite an extensive episode, so I'm not going to waste any more time here in the introduction. I'm just going to dive right in. So I want to discuss a little bit about what the background was for me reading this book, how it was that I came to read Terence McKenna's Food of the Gods. And to be honest with you, I don't really remember. I guess one of the things I want to say is I don't really remember the exact specific sort of reason why I picked this book up. So I do remember hearing off and on throughout the years Joe Rogan talk a lot about Terence McKenna. Joe Rogan, that is, has had Terence McKenna's brother, Dennis McKenna, who's a very interesting figure in of his own right. He's had Dennis McKenna on his podcast at least a couple times, I think. And so I've enjoyed hearing, Joe Rogan talk about McKenna and reflect on his various theories. And then also I've enjoyed hearing Rogan interact with Terence McKenna's brother, who he's co-authored books with before Terence McKenna eventually died. But I've enjoyed hearing these podcasts by Rogan, and that's really, I guess, what stood out before reading this book. That was kind of my main exposure to this Terence McKenna fella. So other than that, I really don't remember hearing or knowing anything about Terence McKenna. So I do know, and probably thanks to, again, Rogan's podcast, that you can listen to McKenna's lectures online, that there's a ton of these lectures available. Many people find them very fascinating and endearing. I've heard other people that aren't such big fans of him, but one way or another, you can find his lectures, many of his lectures, including, I think, him reading his works. If I'm not mistaken, you can find a lot of that online. Now, I personally, other than hearing about him on the Joe Rogan podcast and hearing from his brother Dennis, I really, again, wasn't very familiar with Terence McKenna. I hadn't listened to any of these lectures or anything like that. So, and again, piggybacking on what I said earlier, I don't actually remember what it was specifically that drew me to this book, but somehow, some way, it ended up in my hands. and I actually finished it, April 27th of this year. So it's been over 3 months ago. And I guess I will mention a little bit, why most of these episodes I try to do like right away. In fact, I can't remember which ones, but I specifically remember saying in the episode how I had finished, like the previous day. So a lot of them, I like to do the episode as quick as possible. That makes sense, right? The material's fresh in my mind. But conversely, some of them, there's so much going on. I've found these books that I'm reading, right? There's so much going on that it's impossible to sort of capture what I want to say and flip it around and say it within a day, right? So this is like the complete opposite end of the spectrum. It took a lot of time for me to ruminate on what McKenna has to say. It reminded me a lot of Jerry Mander's 4 Arguments for the Elimination of Television, which I almost did a Book Musings episode on until I realized that there was too much going on. I think I mentioned this in the previous episode, but there's too much going on that I'm probably going to do like a mini series on it at some point, or some sort of mini course. I'm not sure. But that went on, this preparation for that went on for a month before I realized that, well, this was very similar preparing for this episode. I mean, there's so much going on. It took, a lot of time just gathering my thoughts and coming up with a sort of a game plan in terms of how I want to approach what McKenna has to say and what my thoughts are regarding what McKenna has to say. And so, that was part of the main reason why it took so long from me finishing the book to actually now recording it here at the end of July 2022. There were other practical factors in play too, like circumstances here at the house and when I was afforded the opportunity to do recordings and so on. But that was the main factor, really, that it took quite some time to gather my thoughts, to not only do that, but do it in a sort of systematic way that made sense. And so I put a lot of thought, I guess, is kind of the upshot of all that. I put a lot of thought in this episode. It's going to be, like I mentioned, extensive, but hopefully you'll find it worthwhile in the end. We'll go through this and extensively and really tackle what, again, McKenna has to say in this book. Before diving into what the book is about, I thought I'd end the background sort of section and then sort of segue into what the book is about by citing something he said on page 30, which I think is kind of symbolic of sort of the feel of the entire book in a way. So he says on page 30, quote, "Drugs like reality seem destined to confound those who seek clear boundaries and an easy division of the world into black and white," end quote. Things aren't ever that neat, right? And so one of the major upshots that he's going to suggest or argue for, I guess, one of the main points is that we have a very skewed view of drugs, and that's not an accident. He'll suggest, right, that that's a result of governments and the powers that be and so on. But we'll say much more about that. But again, kind of a nice, I think, quote to give us a glimpse of what we're getting into in general. So without further ado, though, let's go ahead and turn our attention to what the book is about. Now, as I mentioned, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on this, especially, I would say, the first part, and maybe a little bit less as we proceed throughout the 4 parts, but we'll spend ample time on each of the parts. So he, again, divides the book into 4 parts. So the first one, let's see, where does he, it's like Paradise is part 1, and then he has part 2, yep, Paradise. Part 2 is Paradise Lost. Part 3 is Hell, and then part 4 is Paradise ? Paradise Regained, question mark. Right, so sort of 4 parts of 4, and I guess in a way 4 things that are going on here. First, he's going to spell out what he means by paradise and what it is in some sense that we've lost. Right, so that's what part 1 or Paradise is about. Part 2, Paradise Lost, is going to sort of convey how it was that we lost what was so good, right? This archaic relationship with nature that he hopes to revive, how it was that we came to lose that paradise, that former relationship we had, that good relationship we had with nature, sort of foreshadowing what paradise means here. And then part 3, Hell, right? Documenting just how bad it's gotten for us, right? And just how much we've lost our way, so to speak. And then he ends, and I appreciate this, with, Paradise Regained, ? Elaborating, discussing the possibilities, right? Reasons for hope, maybe, right? Offering us not necessarily solutions, but possible solutions, right? Prescriptions for courses of action, things to do, to try to remedy the situation as best we can. Okay, so in view of that, right, a lot going on. He divvies it up into these 4 parts. That's the sort of the way that we're going to go through the book as well, is follow him in these 4 parts. So I'm going to begin by discussing part 1, where again he discusses this notion of paradise, what exactly he means by it, and so we can then better understand down the road then what it is we've come to lose, right? And why it is, in many ways, he thinks that so many of us are suffering and in want of something significant that we can't quite pinpoint. So anyway, but before I dive into these 4 parts then, I wanted to say, near the end of the book, so sort of some general preliminary remarks here. Near the end of the book, he writes that, quote, "Years ago, I directed my life's work toward understanding the mystery at the center of the experience induced by tryptamine hallucinogens." He says that in 263. And in the introduction, he suggests, quote, "This book will explore the possibility of a revival of the archaic, or pre-industrial and pre-literate attitude toward community, substance use, and nature, before the rise of the current cultural style we call Western, or the Dominator style," as he'll suggest. And that comes from the introduction, page 16 of the introduction. So, and then combating this Western attitude, or this Dominator attitude, and we'll say more about the Dominator culture versus the partnership culture. That's a distinction that is very important in the book. So we'll say much more and flesh out what we mean by that. But in combating this Western attitude, or this Dominator attitude, or Dominator culture attitude, we'll need to try to get back, he suggests, to this archaic former relationship we had to nature and earth, and become more grounded as we used to be in nature, essentially. So in combating the Western attitude, we will need to, quote, "confront the consequences of denying nature's spiritual dimension, of seeing nature as nothing more than a resource to be fought over and plundered," end quote. And he says that on page 17 of the introduction. Okay, so again, we're going to go sort of offer a deep dive then into what he has to say in the book, beginning with part 1, paradise. So at the beginning of each of my discussions of each of these parts, I'm going to sort of generalize the topics that he's discussing. So in this part, paradise, part 1, he discusses shamanism, and so he'll elaborate on what exactly he means by shamanism, and we'll discuss that here shortly in more depth, in more detail. He discusses food and how important food is in terms of our happiness and well-being, and how we oftentimes don't think about the ramifications of what we eat and how much of a role that actually plays in all facets of our life. Consciousness expansion and how it is we become more conscious, if you will. Stoned ape theory, that's going to be a big thing that's articulated in this first part, and what he's probably most well known for, McKenna in general, is this notion of the stoned ape theory. So we'll flesh out what exactly that amounts to in this part as well. And we'll get into mushrooms and hallucinogens in general. So that's obviously a big theme in the book, right? It's going to turn out to be, right, food of the gods. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about, again, these magic mushrooms, these psilocybin mushrooms, and what exactly they're all about. So all of that's going on in this first part, again, part 1, paradise. So the first sort of concept I thought we should begin with is shamanism. It's an important concept for McKenna, and something he develops and elaborates on throughout not only part 1, but he really touches on shamanism throughout the entire book. So offering up some sort of quotes or his descriptors of shamanism in his own words. So this comes from page 4. He says, quote, "Shamanism is the practice of the upper Paleolithic tradition of healing, divination, and theatrical performance based on natural magic developed 10 to 50,000 years ago. Mircea Eliade, author of Shamanism, Archaic," or sorry, that's not something I wanted to quote. So again, shamanism, this is what I intended to quote. "Shamanism is the practice of the upper Paleolithic tradition of healing, divination, and theatrical performance based on natural magic developed 10 to 50,000 years ago." So that's when it originated, he suggests. All right, so that again was page 4. He says on page 5, "The shaman has access to the superhuman plane, is a master of ecstasy," and that's going to be an important concept as well, as we'll see here in a second. So as a master of ecstasy, can travel in the spirit realm at will, and most important, can cure and divine. Okay. Page 7, he offers again a definition of what a shaman is, or what a shaman amounts to. There he says, quote, a shaman is one who has attained a vision of the beginnings and the endings of all things and who can communicate that vision. And so the general idea is the shaman has some sort of mystical, deeper understanding of reality, right? And moreover is somehow able to convey that in a healthy, meaningful way to others. Okay? So that again was from page 7. Page 11, regarding shamanism and the shaman, McKenna writes, quote, shamanism was beautifully defined by Mircea Eliade as, quote, the archaic techniques of ecstasy. And so that actually comes from Mircea Eliade. And then McKenna, further down the page, writes, the shaman gains entrance into a world that is hidden from those who dwell in ordinary reality. So there's also that. Not only does the shaman have sort of access to deeper meaning, mystical meaning about reality and nature, right? And can convey that in a meaningful way to others, but it's a sort of knowledge that is usually hidden, right? And inaccessible to most of us. Okay, so as you should probably be able to glean by now, he holds shamanism as the shaman in a sort of, he has a lot of respect for the shaman, right? And at least his conception of shamanism suggests that. So that was page 11. Page 12, the last thing I'll say regarding or sort of quote I'll have regarding what he has to say regarding shamanism. So it believes entails belief in the kind of intelligence of another sort. So as he puts it, this is again page 12, quote, shamanic healers insist on the existence of an intelligent other somewhere in a dimension nearby, end quote. So that's another theme that we'll see developed as we proceed here, is that the shaman and the hallucinogenic plants that are oftentimes used to reach ecstasy, which the shaman is after, as we'll see here in a moment, there's this suggestion that there's this access to this normally veiled or hidden sort of reality, as I mentioned a moment ago, right? And that there is this, in fact, other sort of reality that exists, right, outside our natural perceptions of things, right? So that's kind of a big deal, and again, that is a recurring theme, right? That the suggestion that there is this other, right, with a capital O. Okay, now God, no, not necessarily, right? However you want to define it, who's to say, right? But the shaman seems to have some access to this other and the intelligence associated with the other. Okay, that's the suggestion, at least on McKenna's part. Okay, so again, shamanism, a very important concept for McKenna, and hopefully we've kind of got a general idea of what he means by it. Now, I mentioned ecstasy a moment ago, so the shaman's particularly important in McKenna's eyes because he or she can help us reach a state of ecstasy. So ecstasy, this idea of ecstasy, is another important concept for McKenna. So to sort of flesh out what he means by that, I'll quote him on page 59 and 60. So he says on page 59, quote, ecstatic is a word central to my argument and preeminently worthy of further attention. It is a notion that is forced on us whenever we wish to indicate an experience or a state of mind that is cosmic in scale. An ecstatic experience transcends duality. It is an experience that one wishes to have over and over again. It's incredibly intense and complex. And then quoting Gordon Wasson, who he discusses quite often throughout the book as well, so an important figure, this Gordon Wasson figure. He quotes then on page 60 what Gordon Wasson has to say about ecstasy, and I think it does a good job of capturing McKenna's idea of ecstasy. So Wasson writes, this wonderland, so describing sort of ecstatic state, quote, this wonderland is, I submit, precisely where the hallucinogens take us. They are a gateway to ecstasy. When you are in a state of ecstasy, your very soul seems scooped out from your body and away it goes. Who controls its flight? Is it you or your subconscious or a higher power? Everyone experiences ecstasy in his own way and never twice in the same way. So again, that's McKenna, and then also McKenna by way of, or Wasson by way of McKenna, trying to describe that ecstatic state and what we'll mean by ecstasy henceforth as we proceed discussing the rest of the book. All right, so shamanism, ecstasy, the ecstatic state, important concepts for what's going on with respect to the arguments in the book. So he also elaborates on the relationship between shamanism, ecstasy, and then plant intoxication. I mentioned that a moment ago, right? So we have this idea of ecstasy, the ecstatic state, and the idea is the shaman helps us get there, right, through conveying some sort of hidden knowledge, right? He helps us in some sort of way that we otherwise, right, wouldn't be able to get to the state of ecstasy, okay? But there's other routes, right, that can get us to the state of ecstasy, or, maybe it's not only shamanism, right, or the shaman that aids us to getting to the state of ecstasy, but also plants can help us get there. So says Terence McKenna. So again, reflecting on the relationship between shamanism, ecstasy, and plant intoxication, McKenna writes, so this is from page 6, quote, not all shamans use intoxication with plants to obtain ecstasy, but all shamanic practice aims to give rise to ecstasy. All right, that's always the ultimate goal, is the state of ecstasy. So look, not all shamans use intoxication with plants to get there, right? But that's always the goal. Ecstasy is always the goal. And, he acknowledges, so not all shamans use these, plants to get there. Then he says, quote, yet none of these methods is as effective, as ancient, and as overwhelming as the use of plants containing chemical compounds that produce visions. So look, they're not required, right? Not all shamans use these plants, right? These intoxicative plants, but they are the most effective and most widespread means of getting to that ecstatic state. He also writes further down on page 6, quote, if drugs are used, the shaman, not the patient, will take the drug. And that's in the traditional sort of scene, right, where we see the shaman trying to heal others. He contrasts that with our more contemporary medical scene, right, where the doctor gives the patient, the sick person, the drugs, and the patient takes the drugs. He says, well, oftentimes in these traditional scenarios, it's the shaman, right, and maybe sometimes the patients as well, but it's always the shaman consuming the plants or the drugs, right, and the healing process and healing the patient. So that's kind of interesting, right? It's actually the doctor, the shaman in the traditional scenario that becomes intoxicated or takes the drugs. Okay, so that was against page 6. And then on page 70, he writes, so this is describing again sort of our relationship with these plants, right, and the shamans with these plants. And I'm going to butcher this. There's a lot of things he talks about and words he uses that I struggle with, admittedly. He writes, in the Tassili en Aher, and that's some sort of historical location, rock paintings dating from the late Neolithic to as recently as 2,000 years ago. So in this area, right, rock paintings date from the late Neolithic to as recently as 2,000 years ago. Here are the earliest known depictions of shamans with large numbers of grazing cattle. The shamans are dancing with fistful of mushrooms and also have mushrooms sprouting out of their bodies. And so this is the first time sort of McKenna suggests, right, that shamans are specifically not just plants, right, but specifically there's some sort of magical, mystical relationship between the shaman and mushrooms, at least during this period. And he talks a lot about this particular image that they found in that area. And that's depicting a shaman, and he's got these plants, specifically these mushrooms, in hand. And the idea is, right, the shamans of the time period would use these magic mushrooms then, right, to access knowledge that otherwise could not be accessed, and then help, right, those that needed help. So again, there's this relationship between shamanism, ecstasy, or that state of ecstasy, or at the very least, a healthy sort of existence, right? Doing better than how you were doing, right? That's why you need help from the shaman, right? So some sort of relief, right? And then plant intoxication, how those all interact. So we just sort of discussed that there. Another thing he talks a lot about early on, and then we'll develop throughout the rest of the book, is how how much of a role language plays in our reality, and it's something that I didn't necessarily think that much about before, encountering the book. Right, this idea that it's fundamentally important to our construction of reality. And in fact, it's like sort of essential, he would say, to the human beings, at least the human beings' notion of reality. Right, it's every bit as how do I want to put it? For the human being's existence, language is every bit as formative as sort of physical sensations are. And so that'll be a theme, again, that he elaborates on throughout the book. So speaking to that, page 6, he writes, the evidence, so this is the bottom of page 6, and then going on to page 7, he writes, the evidence gathered from millennia of shamanic experience argues that the world is actually made of language in some fashion. And then this is page 7. Reality is not simply experienced or reflected in language, but instead is actually produced by language. And there he was, so in that second part, page 7, he was actually quoting the anthropologist Messiah Landau. So just to give credit where credit is due there. But again, this is all suggesting that that language, right, is just as formidable, plays just as integral a part of the formation of our sense of reality as do sort of physical sensations, let's say touch, feel, etc. Right, and we'll elaborate on this idea as we go on. But language and symbols, how those, the sorts of feelings that those can, for example, the kinds of feelings that those can immediately evoke, right? Those can be just as important and vital in our sense of reality as what we see and touch. Right? So again, reading a book, right? That's language, and that can have a huge impact, right? Can have a huge impact on your sense of reality. It's as much so, if not more, McKenna seems to be arguing, as, again, our physical sense datum. Okay, so that again was page 6 and 7, and then page 8, he writes, he gives examples of, I like this, just how it is that, language can sort of help form our reality, right? And oftentimes in ways we might not necessarily think about. So he gives examples. The Hopi language has no past or future tense of concepts. How then can the Hopi world be like ours? And the Inuit have no first person pronoun. How then can their world be like ours? Right? So, good questions, good examples, I think, to sort of further, to back up his suggestion that, or his notion that language, right, plays a very formidable part of our sense of reality, of what's real, and what's important, and so on. So again, that was page 8. Page 46, he writes, we alone live in an environment that is conditioned not only by the biological and physical constraints to which all species are subject, but also by symbols and language. Our human environment is conditioned by meaning, and meaning lies in the collective mind of the group. Symbols and language allow us to act in a dimension that is supernatural and outside the ordinary activities of other forms of organic life. Further down the page on 46, symbols allow us to store information outside of the physical brain, and that's going to be an important idea for him as well. So again, that was page 46, and then finally, page 51, he writes, with respect to the significance of culture and language, quote, in our species, culture-specific, situation-specific, syntactic software in the form of language can compete with and sometimes replace the instinctual world of hardwired animal behavior. Right? Again, that's the degree to which language can play a role in our reality. Right? It can override even our instincts, he's suggesting. Okay, so that was page 51. And I also wanted to mention, so we sort of started touching on magic mushrooms. What's interesting, I think, is that McKenna takes these hallucinogenic mushrooms, or these magic mushrooms, to be a facilitator of language as well, right? So you have the idea on the one hand that language plays an integral role in our human sense of reality, and then he also posits that magic mushrooms seem to facilitate seem to have facilitated our use of language, right? So were they ultimately, these magic mushrooms, were they ultimately the facilitator by and large of our current conception of reality? That seems to be the implication. So anyway, going back to the general idea, right, that these magic mushrooms are facilitating our sense of language, he writes, this is page 26, chapter 4, so this is in part 1, chapter 1, he writes, previewing chapter 4. Chapter 4 will detail psilocybin's remarkable property of stimulating the language-forming capacity of the brain. Its power is so extraordinary that psilocybin can be considered the catalyst to the human development of language. Okay, so a very strong suggestion there. And then page 42, along that line, suggesting again that magic mushrooms can affect language. He writes, quote, psilocybin's main synergistic effect seems ultimately to be in the domain of language. So he's going to argue, right, that there's this significant effect, that magic mushrooms have this significant effect on human beings' language capacity and abilities. And regarding all this, so especially if you grew up like me, and this will be one of the things I'll mention towards the end of the episode, this is one of the reasons why a lot of this seems so shocking to me. If you grew up like me in the heyday of the DARE program and drugs are bad and so on, a lot of this is going to seem maybe crazy on the face of it, and sort of hocus pocus, but he addresses like a similar line of thinking and suggests that used to be his perspective of a lot of this, but then he suggests, well, he encountered, right, these these hallucinogenic plants for himself, and these shamans for himself, and experienced these things for himself, and then experienced exactly what has been suggested heretofore, and so it then didn't seem as crazy to him. And so I just wanted to mention that, and I think it's interesting, right? He used to think of magic, what he means by magic anyway, and shamanism, and how we described shamanism, and how the shaman has access to something supernatural, if you will, something beyond our general sense of reality, right? Some sort of truth beyond our general sense of reality. Right? He used to think of that as a sort of naive view, right? As primitive, as I would suggest most of us, right? If you were like me, at least, and that used to be my thinking. Not to say that McKenna's convinced me otherwise, right? But I can certainly sort of see how many people who at least grew up in conditions like me, an environment like me, would again share that original view that McKenna had, that a lot of this is, how do you put it, naive and primitive, right? And certainly unscientific, it would seem like, right? And so he concedes that used to be his take as well. He used to think of magic and shamanism as naive and primitive, and to cling to a mechanistic and scientific worldview. That is, until he discovered these hallucinogenic drugs for himself, right? Until he encountered psilocybin mushrooms and ayahuasca in particular in the 70s. So in his words then, supporting what I just said there, this is pages 8 and 9. The rational, mechanistic, anti-spiritual bias of our own culture has made it impossible for us to appreciate the mindset of the shaman. We are culturally and linguistically blind to the world of forces and interconnections clearly visible to those who have retained the archaic relationship to nature. Of course, when I arrived in the Amazon 20 years ago, I knew nothing of the above. Like most Westerners, I believed that magic was a phenomenon of the naive and the primitive, that science could provide an explanation for the workings of the world. In that position of intellectual naivety, I encountered psilocybin mushrooms for the first time. And a little bit lower on page 8, he writes, I also encountered and used visionary brews made from Bannister Iopsis vines, the Yage or Ayahuasca of 1960s underground legend. And again, I apologize for butchering some of that. He continues on page 9, the experiences I had during those travels were personally transforming, and more important, they introduced me to a class of experiences that is vital to the restoration of balance in our social and environmental worlds. And then a little bit lower, he writes, I offer my account as a kind of witness, as an everyman. If these experiences happen to me, then they can be part of the general experience of men and women everywhere. My shamanic education was not unique. Thousands of people have, by one means or another, come to the conclusion that psychedelic plants and the shamanic institutions that their use implies are profound tools of the exploration of the inner depths of the human psyche. My encounters, this is all the way down to the bottom of 9, my encounters with shamanism and hallucinogens in the Amazon convinced me of their salvific importance, right? That they can help provide salvation for those who need it, that they can help elicit true happiness, if you will. And so while he started off with the traditional Westerner dominator culture attitude towards these drugs, these hallucinogenic drugs, and the idea of shamanism, while he started off with that traditional Westerner view, I shouldn't say traditional, with this common Westerner dominator culture view of drugs and of shamanism and so forth, right? He's suggesting, after I encountered them and experienced them myself, I changed my tune. Okay? So moving on, he suggests that much like shamanism, hallucinogenic plants then can help illuminate elements of existence that seem to remain otherwise hidden from us. And that they, not only that, but that these plants, and I'll say more about this later, but these plants seem to exude a kind of intelligence in the process. So along these lines, he writes, quote, no one yet understands the mysterious intelligence within plants or the implications of the idea that nature communicates a basic chemical language that is unconscious but profound. We do not yet understand how hallucinogens transform the message in the unconscious into revelations beheld by the conscious mind, right? But these things happen nonetheless. These revelations happen, but the process is still a bit mysterious to us. But again, there seems to be something going on with hallucinogenic plants. He wants to suggest that's on par with or similar to what's going on in the shamanic experience. And they're both getting us to reach a kind of state of ecstasy or garner something that we otherwise can't, right? And that's through some sort of access to a sort of reality that we, in our natural, everyday sense, can't typically access. And I should say that, I've sometimes wondered about this with respect to drug intoxication, and not just, alcohol or something like that, but, some of these other drugs that he has in mind. It does seem like that maybe our norm, so to speak, that our normal state with respect to our brain is that it's like actively filtering all of reality in certain ways, right? So that we're only sort of perceiving it in certain ways, right? It's actively and intentionally cutting off certain realms or aspects of reality, right? Maybe it would be overload otherwise. For whatever reason, at least this is what I've wondered. Is it the case that our minds, our brains, this is the traditional normal state, right? That it's filtering off certain elements of reality. And then is it the case that these hallucinogenic drugs, I've wondered along the lines of what he seems to be suggesting, do they then sort of minimize that filtering process, or in some other way, however it's the case, do they gain us access then to these other states of reality, or however you want to put it? Hopefully that kind of makes sense. But this is something that I've admittedly wondered about before, and he seems to be speaking to that sort of idea here. And of course, that's not necessarily a novel notion either. Plenty of people have ruminated on that, have thought about that before. Aldous Huxley famously talks about it in The Doors of Perception, his book, The Doors of Perception. Of course, Huxley also wrote Brave New World. In The Doors of Perception, by the way, the book, The Doors of Perception, he talks about, I thought it was mescaline, but I can't remember exactly which hallucinogen. I'm pretty sure it was mescaline, but that were affecting Huxley, but he's talking about kind of that same idea that maybe it's the case that through these certain drugs we are able to access certain realms of reality that we otherwise wouldn't or couldn't. Okay? And by the way, the Doors of Perception by Huxley was then in turn, a little trivia, or if you didn't know, the inspiration for the band The Doors, their name. Then Jim Morrison took it from. Basically was inspired by Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception. Okay, so interesting aside there. So no doubt, I cover everything there, yes. There's no doubt that that McKenna is a huge fan of, nature and earth, and hence he's advocating for, as we'll see, this archaic revival where we go back to how things used to be in glorification of nature and the earth goddess and so on. And along those lines, then he often speaks to the significance of plants and the variety of ways in which they can affect us, right? Just the magnitude of their effects, and not only the magnitude or how significant each of their effects can be, but then the variety of their effects. It really is, that's something that he got me starting to think about. It's just, again, the variety of the effects that plants really do have for us. It's truly staggering. And so he speaks a lot to the significance of these plants and sort of their effects. So along those lines, in the introduction, page, what is that, 19 of the introduction, he says, with respect to the significance of plants, quote, "An honest appraisal of the impact of plants on the foundations of human institutions would find them to be absolutely primary." Right, so thinks they're very influential, very significant. Page 15, again, speaking to how plants significantly affect us. He writes on page 15, quote, "Suppression or expression of sexuality, fertility and sexual potency, degree of visual acuity, sensitivity to sound, speed of motor response, rate of maturation and lifespan. These are only some of an animal's characteristics that can be influenced by food plants with exotic chemistries." Again, going on with respect to that idea that these plants can affect us significantly in a variety of different ways. And not only humans, he references how this is going on with respect to all kinds of different animals, right? Chimpanzees and all sorts of other animals. They've observed how these other animals also use plants for various effects, right? Consume plants for various effects. He talks a lot about the idea of symbiosis and of different life forms working together, whether aware or conscious of it or not. And that's a prominent sort of theme again for him. So along those lines, on pages 17 and 18, he writes, quote, "As plants influenced the development of humans and other animals, so were the plants themselves affected in turn. This coevolution invokes the idea of symbiosis. Symbiosis has several meanings. I use it to mean a relationship between two species that confers mutual benefits upon their members." Okay, so again, he has this idea of symbiosis in mind, and we're going to see that developed as we proceed here, right? With respect to particularly cattle, human beings, and these magic mushrooms, there's this holy trinity, if you will, right? But this idea of symbiosis in plants working with humans, and vice versa, and so on and so forth. Again, that's a common theme that you see the thread of that running throughout much of what he says in the book. Okay, so the idea of symbiosis, page 20, going on with respect to that. So this is with respect to how we help mushrooms, as I alluded to a moment ago, and our relationship with these mushrooms. He writes with respect to that, again on page 20, quote, "Domestication of wild cattle, a great step in human cultural evolution, by bringing humans into greater proximity to cattle, also entailed increased contact with the mushrooms, because these mushrooms grow only in the dung of cattle. As a result, the human-mushroom interspecies codependency was enhanced and deepened. It was at this time that religious ritual, calendar making, and natural magic came into their own." And so, he elaborates on that as well. But again, you get this idea that thanks to the success of, another species, or, in this case, mushrooms, humans can themselves succeed and flourish, and vice versa. So again, speaking to the symbiotic relationship, in this case, mushrooms and wild cattle and human beings. Speaking to how, again, that seems to be at play oftentimes in nature, at least according to McKenna. Page 39. Again, speaking to the symbiotic relationship between mushrooms, human beings, and cattle, he writes, "This relationship between human beings and mushrooms had to have also included cattle, the creators of the only source of the mushrooms, or at least the ones that are responsible for all the effects that he elaborates on in this book, right? The consciousness enhancing mushrooms that he has in mind." So again, that was page 39. Now, all this is sort of setting the stage for, and we've sort of foreshadowed one of the big things that emerges in part one. and that's the idea of the stoned ape, right? The stoned ape theory. And this is perhaps the biggest sort of concept or idea that emerges from the book, in general. The idea that these magic mushrooms, right, that grow in the feces of these cattle, right, these certain types of mushrooms, these magic mushrooms, are responsible for the dramatic sort of increases we see in human cognitive capacities at a certain point in our evolution that we can't seem to otherwise explain. So there's a lot to unpack there. But again, the idea here is this stoned ape theory. This is what McKenna's probably, if there's one thing he's sort of most well known for, it's this idea of the stoned ape theory. So again, what is it? Well, in general, he goes through this, and I'm not as big of a fan of like the historical nuances and dates and so on. But he goes through all of that, the dates and why it is that he infers certain things and so on. But the general idea is that, and most scientists, from my understanding, agree that there's a certain time period in our evolution, the human being's evolution, that there's this exponential sort of increase in our cognitive capacities, in our abilities, mental abilities, and that can't really be explained, that nobody can satisfactorily explain, at least up until McKenna's point in time. He thinks he's able to explain it. And so he gets then into why he thinks that perhaps it's this certain type of mushroom, these magic mushrooms, that perhaps, we, these human beings, consume these magic mushrooms, and then that was then the impetus for this exponential growth in consciousness, this significant consciousness expansion, if you will, a significant increase in our cognitive abilities, our language capacities, and so on and so forth. So again, he suggests that there's this period of time, and he's not alone in this, right? I'm pretty sure that this is a consensus among scientists, that there's this period of time in our evolution that we seem to experience, again, this kind of accelerated growth. Our brain seems to, our brain size seems to grow significantly with respect to the rest of our bodies. What explains that? All right, and there's this accelerated growth, and it for the most part can't be explained. And he posits, though, that again, well, maybe it's these magic mushrooms that the reason for it. Right? So that encapsulates, again, this idea that he's known as the stoned ape theory. So along these lines, page 20, he writes, quote, this is pages 20 to 21, evolution in higher animals takes a long time to occur, operating in time spans of rarely less than 1 million years, and more often tens of millions of years. But the emergence of modern humans from the higher primates, with the enormous changes affected in brain size and behavior, transpired in fewer than 3 million years. Physically, in the last 100,000 years, we have apparently changed very little. But the amazing proliferation of cultures, social institutions, and linguistic systems has come so quickly that modern evolutionary biologists can scarcely account for it. Most do not even attempt an explanation. And then on page 21, he writes, biological and fossil evidence clearly indicates that man is descended from primate ancestors not radically different from primate species still extant. And yet Homo sapiens obviously is in a class apart from the other members of the order. Right? So there's obviously something significantly different about us, right? So what is it? What explains, why we're so far advanced, right, and other primates aren't? Okay, so he's going to say, well, it's this consumption of these magic mushrooms. Page 22, he writes, and again, I don't get in. I'm probably going to butcher some of this. I'm not an anthropologist. I'm not good with all this, but he writes, so some of this is Latin, with Homo habilis began a sudden and mysterious expansion of brain size. The next 2.25 million years brought an unusually rapid evolution in brain size and complexity. And again, he wants to know what explains that. Okay? So what explains the mysterious expansion of our brain size during that time period? Page 24, he writes, with respect to, again, the brain size increasing, quote, such a remarkable rate of evolutionary change in the primary organ of a species implies the presence of extraordinary selective pressures. And so what is going on there? Something going on that's significant. again, he thinks the explanation lies in the consumption of these magic mushrooms that grow in the feces of cattle. Page 37, this is where he sort of suggests or begins to suggest that the mushrooms are the only valid explanation. He writes, and this is again after much thorough argumentation, I would argue. So I'm just kind of glossing over sort of his arguments for why he thinks this is the case. I'm just getting to his conclusion. So he writes, quote, by a process of elimination, we are led to suspect a mushroom might have been involved. And then page 45, the general idea that plants catalyze consciousness, and specifically that these magic mushrooms did during this particular unexplained time period. He writes, less easy to understand is the way in which plant hallucinogens might have provided similar yet different adaptive advantages. They catalyze consciousness, that peculiar self-reflecting ability that has reached its greatest apparent expression in human beings. They do not, however, cause consciousness, which is a generalized function present in some degree in all life forms. Catalyst is a speeding up of a process that is already present. There are processes that are already present. And then later down on page 45, he continues, we must now come to terms with the fact that those apes were stoned apes. Being stoned seems to have been our unique characteristic. So what stands out about us, what seems to be different, what it might explain the significant growth in our brains? Well, we were stoned. We ate magic mushrooms. Right? That's what McKenna is suggesting here. A very interesting theory to say the least. So his revolutionary theory, in his own words, page 24, he writes, quote, my contention is that mutation-causing psychoactive chemical compounds in the early human diet directly influenced the rapid reorganization of the brain's information processing capacities. Alkaloids in plants, specifically the hallucinogenic compounds such as psilocybin, dimethyltryptamine or DMT, and harmaline, could be the chemical factors in the proto-human diet that catalyze the emergence of human self-reflection, end quote, or consciousness, right? So again, that was from page 24. So big suggestion here is that these magic mushrooms are enhancing our abilities, right? And specifically with respect to consciousness and our thinking or cognitive abilities. And so, McKenna, I thought it would behoove us to give an overview of, McKenna's 3 levels. He talks about there being these 3 levels or stages of psilocybin intoxication. So intoxication from magic mushrooms. Right? There's sort of 3 different levels or stages, and all of them confer benefits or advantages. Okay, and specifically, or what we want to note particularly here is evolutionary advantages. He suggests. Okay? So these levels or stages are based on doses, right? So a level or stage 1, we're talking about what we would call a very small dose, or microdosing, if you're familiar with that expression. So the idea is there's no psychoactive intoxication. We're not we're not seeing things visually or hearing things. Nothing is enhanced in that sense, right? You don't really even, for the most part, realize that you're intoxicated, if you will, right? So it's a very small dose, or what's known as microdosing. And what happens there, we still glean some advantages. And I will say, fast forward from McKenna's time, research that I've read about suggests that actually microdosing psilocybin mushrooms is one of the most beneficial forms of therapy there is. So again, speaking to this idea that even at very low doses, the consumption of these magic mushrooms or psilocybin mushrooms can be beneficial. Right? The research nowadays, or contemporary research, seems to further validate what McKenna suggests. So with respect to this level 1 or stage 1 intoxication, right, where you're not even consciously sort of aware, you don't feel like it anyway that you're even affected. Right? He says it imparts a noticeable increase in visual acuity, especially edge detection. Excuse me. So that was on page 25. So as he elaborates on, then this would confer great hunting advantages. Remember, so these hunter and gatherer societies, right, which rely on hunting for their sustenance, right? This stage 1 or level 1 consumption of these psilocybin mushrooms, that's going to confer a great huge benefit if it's in fact increasing your visual ability, right? If you can see things better, especially as it's suggested, right, on the edge or on the periphery of your vision, you're going to survive. You're going to have greater odds of surviving since you're going to see more of what you're hunting than those who don't consume these, right, at a stage or level 1 dose. Okay, so again, and he actually, I like the way he kind of refers to this advantage. He calls it a kind of chemical binocular, right? It enhances your abilities through this chemical interaction, right? From the magic mushrooms, it's giving you sort of chemical binoculars, if you will. So again, it confers this sort of hunting benefit we can imagine. So level 2 or stage 2, it's obviously a little stronger than we're talking here about psychoactive doses here. You are becoming noticeably affected. As he writes, psilocybin is and this is a quote from page 26, quote, psilocybin is a stimulant of the central nervous system, right? So we're at these doses, it in fact is again a stimulant. So thereby it's increasing restlessness and sexual arousal, thanks to which he says, quote, the mushrooms directly favored human reproduction, end quote. So he's arguing here at this sort of level 2, where you're taking more of the magic mushrooms. It's going to act as a stimulant, and it's going to increase libido, he suggests, and all of this is going to help successful copulation, right? Human reproduction, again, a boon for the species. And then level 3, we're talking significant doses, very strong doses. As he says, quote, the level of the full-blown shamanic ecstasy, wholly other, the boundary-dissolving qualities of shamanic ecstasy predispose hallucinogenic using tribal groups to community bonding and to group sexual activities, end quote. That's page 26. So we're talking about substantial doses. And what he's getting at is that this is boundary-dissolving, right? It brings us all together. It encourages group sexual activity, which again promotes successful reproduction. And it gets us access to the other, right? This sort of what we've been alluding to with respect to what the shaman can also access, right? This otherly intelligence, or however you want to think of it. Okay? So that's how mushrooms, then, hallucinogenic mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms, can get us in contact with the other, okay? Or sort of the mystical, or how do you want to put it? How do I want to put it? I should say, put us in touch with what really matters in life, in some sense, he would say, right? The beauty and the emphasis on earth, right? And the earth goddess that was dominant in the back in the good old days, he would say, but that we are altogether have lost nowadays. That's what we can rekindle in this sort of level 3, stage 3 dose of these magic mushrooms. Okay, hopefully that was somewhat clear. Oops, I think I flipped this around. There we go. So in sum, our abilities are enhanced with psilocybin, to say the least, right? He's a big fan. He thinks it's conferred huge advantages to us, and it explains, he thinks, a lot about our evolution that otherwise could not be adequately explained, or that has not otherwise been adequately explained. So page 25, again, going along these lines of the suggestion that in sum it's enhancing our abilities, he reflects on what Roland Fisher, this was a researcher who looked into what psilocybin can do. He did a lot of research on graduate students and then tested their performance ability in various ways. And so McKenna is quoting Fisher then, who after studying the results, sees that, wow, they were affected in positive ways. He quotes Fisher as saying, quote, you see, what is conclusively proven here is that under certain circumstances, one is actually better informed concerning the real world if one has taken a drug than if one has not, end quote. So that lends support, again, to the idea that maybe certain drugs, at least, again, I'm not saying go get hammered on alcohol and you're going to see all sorts of aspects of reality that you otherwise can't. Right? But it does seem to suggest, along the lines I was suggesting earlier, right, that maybe there are certain elements of certain drugs that can help us tap into certain dimensions of reality that we otherwise can't. Right? That can make sense. So that was page 25. Page 26. Again, with respect to the general adaptive advantages of mushrooms, he writes, at whatever dose the mushroom was used, it possessed the magical property of conferring adaptive advantages upon its archaic users and their group. So again, general statement supporting the idea that they're advantageous at whatever dose. Okay, and then page 28, he writes, with respect to mushrooms and aiding in our survival, quote, the psilocybin using individuals evolved epigenetic rules or cultural forms that enabled them to survive and reproduce better than other individuals. Okay, so it helped, in his opinion, again, his argument is that these magic mushrooms helped those who consumed them survive more than those who didn't consume these magic mushrooms, right? It enhanced or increased one's survival ability. So certainly an interesting theory, one that at least I had never really encountered until reading McKenna's book. So we've kind of gotten into like this idea of his that a lot of in this, or at least the implication of his ideas that what it means to be human, right? He associates with sort of our thinking, cognitive abilities. Excuse me, and he again associates a lot of that with our consumption of magic mushrooms. So along those lines, on page 46, he writes, quote, all the unique characteristics and preoccupations of human beings can be summed up under the heading of cognitive activities. Dance, philosophy, painting, poetry, sport, meditation, erotic fantasy, politics, and ecstatic self-intoxication. We are truly Homo sapiens, the thinking animal. Our acts are all a product of the dimension that is uniquely ours, the dimension of cognitive activity, of thought and emotion, memory and anticipation, of psyche. So what's unique about us? His suggestion is, all these cognitive activities. So that was page 46. In 32, he writes, the notion we're exploring in this book is that a particular family of active chemical compounds, the indole hallucinogens, played a decisive role in the emergence of our essential humanness, of the human characteristic of self-reflection. Right? So he's described what it is to be human. And again, there's this other idea then that a lot of what we associate with what it is to be human, what's responsible for that was the consumption of these indole hallucinogens, right? Or psilocybin, for example. Page 52. So again, this idea that mushrooms in part made us human, he writes, the impact of hallucinogens in the diet has been more than psychological. Hallucinogenic plants may have been the catalyst for everything about us that distinguishes us from other higher primates, for all the mental functions that we associate with humanness. Okay, so that was page 52, and then finally, page 42. He writes, it could have had an impact on the sudden emergence of consciousness and language used in early humans. We literally may have eaten our way to higher consciousness. Okay, so how did we become human and acquire all these thinking and cognitive abilities? We ate our way to them, right? We got stoned by eating these magic mushrooms. So another big theme, so I said a lot comes out in this first part, right? Part one. So another very important thing that we need to flesh out here is this distinction between, I think I mentioned it and referred to it before, but sort of dominator Western societies and cultures versus what he means by archaic or partnership societies, right? The former, these Western dominator cultures or societies tend to be masculine or associated with the masculine, whereas the archaic partnership societies tend to be associated with the feminine, earth, nature, Mother Earth, goddess, or however you want to put it, right? So we have this juxtaposition, this distinction that is underlying, again, a lot of what's going on in this book. And the suggestion, again, is that we started off when we had the proper relationship with nature and these hallucinogenic plants. We had these kind of partnership societies that were dominant. as archaic or partnership societies. And we had a lot of reverence for the feminine, okay, and appreciation for nature and earth and so on. So that's sort of what was present during paradise, and when we experienced paradise, okay, which he's elaborating on here in part 2. And then what happens is, we'll see as the book progresses, right, as we lose, right, these archaic partnership societies, these societies that emphasize the feminine, the earthly, nature, they become less and less dominant, right, and instead the Western dominator societies begin to flourish, right, and we lose touch with nature and an emphasis on the earth and so on. And so, in some sense, the rest of the whole book is going to explain how that's happened and hopefully, offer some suggestions for how we can get ourselves out of the mess and back to where we started, right, in a kind of archaic revival, which is one of his other books, by the way. So anyway, so all of this is built upon this, right, all that sort of stuff. What's underlying it, right, is this distinction between archaic and partnership societies, which used to dominate, right, and the Western dominator societies. I shouldn't say use dominate when one of the terms is dominator societies, right, but the partnership societies used to flourish and be most pervasive. But nowadays we have the Western dominator sort of societies that are most common, and you don't see the archaic partnership societies. I should say he borrows the partnership versus dominator society's distinction from, I don't know how to say the name, Rian Eisler's. I know this is a very popular book, though, The Chalice and the Blade. So this distinction is not McKenna's. He does borrow it from this very popular work, The Chalice and the Blade, which I've not read. But then he uses the distinction. So he writes, dominator cultures are hierarchical, paternalistic, materialistic, and male-dominated, as I've already suggested. He writes that on page 20 of the introduction. While, again, the opposites are true of partnership cultures then, right? They're going to be maternalistic, not materialistic, and female-dominated. And that's the idea is, again, that's how it used to be, and not how it is anymore. Now we have these contemporary Western dominator cultures where it's hierarchical, paternalistic, and materialistic. Okay, so needless to say, our historical discovery of mushrooms was significant for McKenna on a number of fronts. As for example, it coincides with the initial emergence of the partnership societies. So when these partnership societies, back in the day when they were so prolific and were flourishing, he attributes it in a large sense to, again, the discovery of and the consumption of these mushrooms. Okay, so when we had this paradise, right? Part 1's titled Paradise. When we had this paradise, okay, when these partnership societies in which we experienced paradise, when they were prevalent and prolific and flourishing, it was when we discovered and consumed these mushrooms. Okay, so paradise was a result of psilocybin mushrooms, essentially. So page 74. Again, he writes, the Tasil and Ahar of 12,000 BC, or however you're supposed to say that, may well have been the partnership paradise whose loss has created one of the most persistent and poignant of our mythological motifs. Right, so he's describing this. This is perhaps the paradise, right? We have this idea of paradise lost. Well, maybe this is the idea of paradise that we have in these kinds of reflections, right? Maybe it existed during this mushroom-consuming time period. So the Tasil and Ahir of 12,000 BC may well have been the partnership of paradise whose loss has created one of the most persistent and poignant of our mythological motifs, the nostalgia for paradise, the idea of a lost golden age of plenty, partnership, and social balance. The contention here is that the rise of language, partnership, society, and complex religious ideas may have occurred not far from the area where humans emerged, the game-filled, mushroom-dotted grasslands and savannas of tropical and subtropical Africa. There the partnership society arose and flourished. There hunter-gatherer culture slowly gave way to domestication of animals and plants. In this milieu, the psilocybin-containing mushrooms were encountered, consumed, and deified. Language, poetry, ritual, and thought emerged from the darkness of the hominid mind. So mushrooms played a huge role in what's going on here when we became human, right, and in the process of becoming human, right, and when we were flourishing because of these partnership societies. Again, mushrooms played a huge role, particularly these magic psilocybin mushrooms. So, needless to say, the increasing influence of dominator society is at odds with the archaic partnership societies, right, with their appreciation of love and nature, right? We don't see the appreciation of love and nature nowadays like McKenna, thinks we used to see it back in the archaic sort of times that he's referring to, right, when partnership societies were prominent and flourishing. So, again, there's something about these dominator societies, these dominator cultures, that's at odds with this emphasis on an appreciation of nature and earth. So along those lines, he writes, this is page 66, quote, "These powerful plants that change our relationship to our sexuality and our view of self and world are the special province of peoples whom we are accustomed to thinking of as primitive. This is but one more indication of the extent to which unconsciously imbibed dominator attitudes have robbed us of participation in the wider and richer world of eros and the spirit." Again, the idea is, since we've lost touch with these partnership societies and these dominator societies have become more prominent, right, we're being deprived of something, right, this appreciation of love and nature that we used to have. Okay? Page 90. Along similar lines, the idea, that the partnership societies are being repressed in the process. He writes, quote, "Suppression of the feminine and of knowledge of the natural world has been the hallmark of the intervening centuries," right? As the dominator cultures and societies have become more and more prominent, they've suppressed naturally the opposite, right? The partnership feminine societies and cultures. Okay. So back in the day when the partnership societies, right, were more prominent, and they had the emphasis on love of nature, right, and earth, and they worshipped, the great earth goddess. During that time period, there was what McKenna refers to as a Shamanic Trinity, which reflects back on what I've already referenced, right? This idea that there was a symbiotic relationship between human beings, cattle, and mushrooms. So he references and discusses again that Shamanic Trinity on page 89. He writes, quote, "It is impossible not to see in the cult of the great goddess and the cattle cult of the late Neolithic a recognition of the mushroom as the third and hidden member of a kind of Shamanic Trinity. The mushroom seemed to be as much a product of cattle as our milk, meat, and manure was recognized very early as the physical connection to the presence of the goddess." Okay, so again, during this time period when these partnership societies were prominent and flourishing, there was this respect for mushrooms, right? And they were seen as every bit as important, right, product of cattle as was milk and so on. Okay? So that was page 89. So, as we'll see, and as I've suggested and intimated, he thinks we've lost this paradise, as we'll see going into the next part 2, Paradise Lost. He thinks we've sort of lost this original paradise we had when the partnership societies were in charge, so to speak. And he hopes for, ultimately, a return to what we had, an archaic revival again. Let's get back to how things were. And that's what he ultimately is hoping we can achieve. And again, later in the book, in part 4 in particular, he'll offer his sort of prospects for how we can best accomplish that archaic revival. But right now, I want to reference page 92, his hope. So he writes, this is fairly early on in the book still, page 92, quote, "In view of our present cultural impasse, I conclude that the next evolutionary step must involve not only a repudiation of dominator culture, but an archaic revival and a rebirth of awareness of the goddess." The emphasis on earth, right? The worship of the feminine, of the earth and of nature. Further down, page 92, Quote, returning to the balance of the planetary partnership style means trading the point of view of the egoistic dominator for the intuitional, feeling-toned understanding of the maternal matrix. Right? That's what he hopes that we will return to eventually, at least. Okay, so that was an extensive discussion of part one, where he really, in some sense, extensively fleshes out how the good old days were, right? How it was that we became human, when we became human, that certain interesting time period, right, where we dramatically became more conscious and thinky, and our cognitive abilities were significantly enhanced. That was a great time period, and what was prominent during that time period? Well, he would say these partnership societies, and so again, what he did in part one is elaborate on all the boons of that time period. Okay, so part two, moving on to part two, we move on to Paradise Lost. What he titles part two. He's going to go over basically how it is that we've come to lose touch with the earth and with nature and respect for the feminine and so on, and how it is in turn that the dominator cultures and societies have become so prolific, so prominent, how they are in fact so common. Why is that the case? So as I did in part one, I want to start by just throwing out the general sort of subjects here. So this part details losing mushrooms, losing touch with the magic mushrooms, the psilocybin mushrooms, and with hallucinogenic drugs in general, you might say. And then in the process, seeking a replacement, okay? And that's going to sort of encapsulate the whole idea of losing paradise, right? There's going to be, in fact, sort of some steps involved that he will elaborate on and that we'll get to in a moment, okay? He's going to talk about opium, alcohol, cannabis, honey, in fact, and so we'll talk about a lot of these other substances then that were sort of, he thinks, substituted for the original magic mushroom, the original food of the god, right? And in the process, right, because they're inferior substitutes, you might say, how we've come to lose what we had before, right? Paradise. Okay, so that's what is on the table here. The first thing that I think we should sort of flesh out from part two, and that he has a lot to say about, and I'll have a lot of extensive quotes here from him with regard to, is the prohibition of plants, any drugs, really, as we'll see. He's going to suggest that it's ridiculous, especially given that alcohol, which is much more insidious, is legal, right? So another theme that's recurring throughout the book, but especially starts to come to the forefront in part two, I would say. So that's why I'm emphasizing it now. So again, the idea here is that he wants to say prohibition is ridiculous, and it's a reflection of ultimately the dominator cultures and societies trying to enforce, right, certain values upon us, okay, that again he thinks are not conducive to ultimately our flourishing, right? That's why he's advocating alternatively an archaic revival, or return to the ulterior, or another way of looking at things and doing things, right? The partnership way, the feminine way, the partnership society and culture way. So anyway, going back again to the general idea of the prohibition is bad, right? Lots to say there. Page 98, he writes, with respect to, anti-prohibition, he writes right off the bat, quote, "Let us declare nature to be legitimate. The notion of illegal plants is obnoxious and ridiculous in the first place," end quote. So that was page 98. Page 149, he writes, quote, I like this one again. He can't understand why we're prohibiting plants, especially when things like alcohol are legal. He writes, quote, "The strongest argument for the legalization of any drug is that society has been able to survive the legalization of alcohol. If we can tolerate the legal use of alcohol, what drug cannot be absorbed in the structure of society?" End quote. So, look, why are we prohibiting these other things when we're not even prohibiting alcohol? 208, of course, he has explanations for that, but you get the idea there. Again, with respect to the lunacy of prohibition, he says, quote, "Even to this day, with statistics showing that alcohol kills 10 times more often than heroin addiction is still viewed as the depths of drug depravity. And then later on he writes on 208, quote, tobacco addicts might kill for their fix too if they had to, but instead they simply walk out to a 7-Eleven to buy cigarettes. Same thing with alcoholics, right? So again, the idea being, heroin addicts are portrayed as being willing to kill for their next fix. Well, tobacco and alcohol addicts might do the same thing if their drugs were illegal as well. So the hypocrisy, he often ruminates on the hypocrisy of the laws, right, and how they're clearly sort of slanted in favor of, again, what he would say is the dominator culture, the dominator society, right, and its values. Okay, so that was page 208. 218, he writes, from a historical point of view, restricting the availability of addictive substances must be seen as a peculiar, perverse example of Calvinistic dominator thought, a system in which the sinner is to be punished in this world by being transferred into an exploitable, hapless customer, who is punished for addiction by being relieved of his cash by the criminal governmental combine that provides the addictive substances. Okay, so that was page 218. 244 to 245. Lots to say on the subject of prohibition. He writes, the bottom of page 244, there can be no saying no to drugs. Our only reasonable course is decriminalization of drugs, mass education, and shamanism as an interdisciplinary and professional approach to these realities. So that was 244 and 245. Page 255, he writes, quote, it cannot be said too often. The psychedelic issue is a civil rights and civil liberties issue. It is an issue concerned with the most basic of human freedoms, religious practice, and the privacy of the individual mind. A little bit further down, we are told that drugs cannot be legalized because society would disintegrate. This is puerile nonsense. End quote. Again, that was page 255. Page 260, he writes, with respect to psilocybin and DMT being Schedule 1 drugs, he writes, psilocybin, quote, psilocybin and DMT were made Schedule 1 without any scientific evidence at all being represented for or against their use, end quote. Page 266, he writes, quote, the war on drugs is schizophrenically waged by governments that deplore the drug trade and yet are also the major guarantors and patrons of the international drug cartels. Such an approach is doomed to failure. The war on drugs was never meant to be won. Instead, it will be prolonged as long as possible in order to allow various intelligence operations to wring the last few hundreds of millions of dollars in illicit profits from the global drug scam. So, why are certain ones prohibited and certain ones not? Because it's profitable to those that are in charge as well. That's one of the sentiments suggested here, or arguments suggested here. Page 267, quote, the conclusion seems obvious. Only legalization can lay the basis for a sane drug policy. Indeed, this opinion has been reached by most disinterested commentators on the problem. That being the key word, disinterested, right? Legalization, right? No prohibition of any drug, especially natural plants, right? He thinks that that's the obvious outlook we should have, right? The obvious legal stance the government should have. But again, it's not the most profitable, and so that's why things are as they are, he suggests. Okay, so lots to say. That last one, once again, was from page 267. Lots to say with respect to prohibition and the idea that we should be legalizing all these things. Okay? So, how is it that we got here? How did we ultimately lose paradise? Not only are we not consuming magic mushrooms, but they're illegal. How is that the case? Well, he chronicles, as I alluded to earlier, 4 stages, stages of losing our way. 4 steps is what I was looking for. There's steps along the process, right, in terms of how we lost our way. So he says, look, step 1, well, actually, let me describe the process in general. Page 121, right, this idea that we've lost paradise lost, and that there's been these sort of steps along the way. He writes, top of page 121, the beginning of chapter 8, quote, nostalgia for paradise appears quite naturally in a dominator society. The abandonment of the original catalyst for the emergence of self-reflection and language, the Stropharia cubensis psilocybin-containing mushroom, has been a process with 4 distinct stages. Each stage represents a further dilution of awareness of the power and the numinous meaning resident in the mystery. I didn't say that very well, but basically, there's these, again, 4 steps or stages that have emerged in the process of losing, right, our symbiotic relationship that we once had with, you mentioned, Stropharia cubensis psilocybin-containing mushroom. That's the Latin official name for the magic mushroom, basically. And again, it's been the process of losing our original relationship we had with those magic mushrooms. There's been, he wants to say 4, there's been 4 stages to that process. So what are those stages? Initially, we have, quote, this is stage 1. We have the introduction of other psychoactive plant substitutes for the original mushroom. Page 121. So we still have a psychoactive drug or plant that's being consumed in the sort of process, right, of trying to reach ecstasy, but it's not the original, right? It's not the magic mushroom, and that's going to be problematic in some sense, because in some sense he wants to suggest everything is sort of not as good, right, as the magic mushrooms themselves. We can only sort of strive for that sort of original ecstatic experience that we had with the magic mushrooms, right? So we'll never sort of reach that unless we actually start consuming the magic mushrooms themselves again, right? So stage 1 was substituting other drugs or plants. At least we were doing that, right? But they were so there are other psychoactive drugs or plants, but they weren't the actual magic mushrooms. And in discussing this sort of point, I find it interesting when he states, quote, no greater shift of social values is possible to imagine than that which would accompany the gradual changeover of a psilocybin cult to an alcohol cult. And, throughout this whole process, from the beginning when we have these partnership societies and cultures in place, to now where we have the dominator culture of society dominating, we've had a huge sort of shift from the psilocybin to begin with to alcohol ultimately, as we'll see. He'll say more on this, right? Where alcohol is now sort of emphasized, and you don't see any, for the most part, consumption of psilocybin mushrooms. So what's interesting with respect to this quote is that's exactly what has transpired historically, right? We've gone from a psilocybin cult, if McKenna can be believed, okay, and his stoned ape theory is correct, we've gone from a psilocybin cult to an alcohol cult, right? And nowadays, if you think about it, right, alcohol is ingrained in our culture, and so in that sense, we're an alcohol cult, right? Well, we've gone from the psilocybin cult that he references, right, to an alcohol cult. So again, page 122, he writes, no greater shift of social values is possible to imagine than that which would accompany the gradual changeover of a psilocybin cult to an alcohol cult, right? And that's exactly what we've seen transpire historically. Okay, step 2 or stage 2, he writes of this second step or stage, quote, the second step, this is from 122, is the substitution of a completely inactive materials for active ones. In this situation, the substitutes, though usually still plants, are really no more than symbols of the former power of the mystery to authentically move initiates. Okay, so we still have something being consumed, right, but it's not creating any psychoactive effects. So we're even further removed from the original experience of consuming magic mushrooms, right, where we are having intense psychoactive effects, right? If we talked about the 3 different doses, oftentimes we're having this intense psychoactive effects, right? Remember stage 1, well, we're not consuming the magic mushrooms anymore, but we're still having some sort of psychoactive effects via some other drug or plant. Well, here in stage 2, right, maybe we're still consuming a plant, but there's no psychoactive, right, effect going on. Okay, so we're even further removed then from the original experience of consuming these magic mushrooms. Stage 3, and this is from page 122 as well, he writes, so now, quote, symbols are all that is left. Not only are psychoactive plants now out of the picture, but plants of any sort have disappeared. Today's major world religions are typical of this stage, end quote. So the idea, again, is we sort of strive for this state of ecstasy, but we're no longer even consuming any sort of plant or drug, let alone experiencing certain psychoactive effects from it. All that remains is sort of a vague emphasis on the state of ecstasy that we might glean from things like religion, let's say, what we normally would think of religion. And in saying a lot of this, McKenna, so I just want to make sure this is clear because some of this might be misconstrued otherwise, right? He has nothing, he doesn't speak ill of religion in general by any means. So I just want to make that clear because some of what he could say, again, when taken out of context, could be construed as, him being down on religions, but that's not the case at all. He has, I would say, a great respect for the religious experience, if you will. But anyway, so the problem, right, with religions nowadays, he would argue, right, is that that they are not reaching the state of ecstasy that they otherwise could, with, right, these hallucinogenic plants. And so, in some sense, you might say he would question the authenticity of the state of ecstasy, right? Are they really delivering the sort of ecstasy that can be delivered by way of the shamanic experience or these hallucinogenic plants, or are they just sort of a corporate message wrapped up in a certain way, right? Or I don't know if I said that right, but is it really just something corporate going on that seems inauthentic when you really analyze it further? I think that's the sort of thing that McKenna would suggest here, right, with respect to stage 3 and where we're at. And actually, we're heading then into stage 4, so we're kind of evolving from or leaving stage 3, heading into stage 4. What is stage 4? Again, page 122, he talks about this. We finally arrive at, quote, the complete abandonment of even the pretense of remembering the felt experience of the mystery. This last stage is typical, right? So you lose all connection to nature and to the wonder and the sense of mystery that there's something going on, right? And that there is some other, right? As indefinable and ineffable as it may be, right? That there's something mysterious and magical going on, right? And the emphasis on nature and earth and so on. So again, we arrive at, quote, the complete abandonment of even the pretense of remembering the felt experience of the mystery. This last stage is typified by secular scientism as perfected in the 20th century. And what's worse, we even have, quote, the rediscovery of the mystery and its interpretation as evil and threatening to social values. The current suppression of psychedelic research and the hysteria fanned by pharmacophobic media is an obvious case in point, end quote. Right, so again, we have, not only have we had this sort of emphasis on nature and earth and worship of the earth goddess and so on, have we lost touch with that, but we've even had it vilified, if you will. And we've had, these sort of plants prohibited, so on and so forth. Okay, so in sum, everything has been kind of turned on its head, he would argue, and reverence for the mystery of life and of existence and the sacred nature of existence and of life, as well as respect for nature and earth, that's all been lost. Okay, which again he thinks is bad. We need, therefore, an archaic revival, a return to how things once were before it got out of hand here. Okay, so page 137, along those lines here. So the loss of the sacred is complete, he suggests. Quote, Christianity's triumph ended the glorification of nature and planet as supreme spiritual forces. What Eisler called the triumph of the blade of Dominator's social models of paternalism and patriarchy was everywhere complete. Humankind, and this is a little bit later down on the page, humankind crossed a watershed into the progressively more vacant, more ego-dominated world whose energies were coalescing into monotheism, patriarchy, and male domination. Henceforth, the great society shaping plant relationships of the old world's past would decline to the status of mysteries. The dark night of the planetary soul that we call Western civilization began. So again, that's sort of speaking to the idea that we've lost touch with the glorification of nature and the planet. Okay. 138 and 139. Quote, history is the story of our unfocused agony over the loss of this perfect human world, and then of our forgetting it altogether, denying it, and in doing so, denying a part of ourselves. And later on page 139, the consequence of not seeing ourselves as part of the green engine of vegetable nature is the alienation and despair that surrounds us and threatens to make the future unbearable. Okay, so again, this process whereby we've lost touch with the partnership societies and dominator society cultures have become more prominent. That explains a lot of our frustration and despair that we experience, that so many of us experience. Again, at least that's McKenna's argument here. So he offers, we talked about how there's these various substitutes, and these stages, right, that have been offered in lieu of the original magic mushroom, right? So he offers his thoughts on these various substances that we've used as substitutes at various times. Okay, so in general, describing that, for example, the bleak task. All right, he has a lot to say about the task in general of trying to find a substitute. Again, he doesn't think there is a suitable substitute. The best we'll ever have is that original consumption of the magic mushroom. At least given his descriptions of all these other substitutes, they don't seem near as good, right? So in general, he says on page 141, quote, each intoxicant, each effort to recapture the symbiotic balance of the human mushroom relationship in the lost African Eden is a paler, more distorted image of the original mystery than the last. It's not as good as an original, all right, scenario where we were consuming the magic mushrooms. So the first thing he mentions, and I won't say too much about this, is honey. He talks a little bit about honey, and he says honey's magical. He literally calls it magical. And after all, it's been used to preserve, as he mentions, magic mushrooms, right, among other things. So it preserves magic mushrooms, therefore it also must be magical. I guess that's how that line of thinking goes. But, it's kind of funny. Over the years, I've come to appreciate the merits of honey, you might say, as well. Big proponent of honey. My kids would be able to verify that. We have all kinds of honey up in the kitchen. So I concur, honey is magical. He seems to have a lot of respect for it. Talks a little bit about it, but we'll sort of set that aside. The more interesting reflections he offers are what he says next about alcohol. So alcohol, not as much of a fan, not a fan at all, seemingly, of alcohol. So along those lines, page 146, he writes, quote, no other drug has had such a prolonged detrimental effect on human beings. And then on 147, quote, I have implied that alcohol is the dominator drug par excellence. There's something about alcohol that endears itself, for whatever reason, to the dominator culture, right? And there's a reason then why it's so prominent in our culture nowadays, right? And when the dominator cultures in society are so prominent themselves. And then he writes a little bit lower on 147, quote, moderation in drinking seems the obvious course, yet alcoholism is a major and unremitting problem throughout global society. I believe that the alcohol abuse syndrome is symptomatic of the state of disequilibrium and tension existing between men and women and between the individual and society. Alcoholism is a condition of ego obsession and inability to resist the drive toward immediate gratification. So not a lot of positive things to say about alcohol, clearly. Page 148, he says, quote, this is a difficult subject to address. Alcohol is used by millions of people, both men and women, and I will make no friends by taking the position that alcohol culture is not politically correct. Could it not be that we are willing to pay the terrible toll that alcohol extracts because it is allowing us to continue the repressive dominator style that keeps us all infantile and irresponsible participants in a dominator world characterized by the marketing of ungratified sexual fantasy? Could it be? So, again, not a huge fan of alcohol. So, he does make an interesting, important, I think, sort of remark with respect to distilled versus non-distilled alcohol. And he suggests that, look, non-distilled alcohol has been around for a long time, and for the most part, it wasn't really problematic. When alcohol became problematic is when we started distilling it, trying to purify it, right, tinker with what's, you might say, natural. And so then this also reflects what he thinks is an important distinction between natural and synthetic drugs. So along those lines, he writes, this is from 142, quote, this is with respect to alcohol, it was the first highly concentrated and purified drug, the first synthetic drug. This distinction is very important for the argument to be made here. Alcoholism as a social and community problem appears to have been rare before the discovery of distillation. Just as heroin addiction was the malignant flower that sprang from the relatively benign habit of opium use, so distilled alcohol changed the sacred art of the brewer and the vintner into a profane economic engine for the consumption of human hopes. So I thought that was kind of interesting that, it's not necessarily that alcohol itself is bad, it's the sort of the distilling of it and trying to make it something that it naturally wasn't, right? And in that process, we seem to have then all these problems that we associate with alcohol seem to have emerged along that way. So I thought that was a pretty interesting remark on his part. So cannabis, then, he has a lot to say about. He talks about that next. He views cannabis very favorably, and it seems to be, for him, second only to mushrooms in inspiring partnership societies. At least that's what I glean from a lot of the things he says. Let me start by saying that, and I didn't know this going into reading this, but apparently consuming marijuana can be comparable to a hallucinogen when it's consumed in extremely concentrated amounts. So along those lines, he writes on page 150, quote, when the resin of the cannabis plant is collected together into black, sticky balls, its effects are comparable to the power of a hallucinogen, providing that the material is eaten. This is the classic hashish. So, I guess, sort of thought of hashish as, being consumed, but I guess if you eat, right, the highly concentrated resin of marijuana, if you can eat that, then the effects are comparable to these hallucinogenic drugs that he references. Page 163 also talks about that, and among other things. There he writes, quote, in our culture, private drug taking is viewed as dubious. Solitary drug use is viewed as positively morbid. And indeed, all introspection is seen this way. The archaic model for use of psychoactive plants, including cannabis, is quite the opposite. Ritual, isolation, and sensory deprivation are the techniques used by the archaic shaman seeking to journey in the world of the spirits and ancestors. There is also no doubt that when used occasionally in a context of ritual and culturally reinforced expectation of a transformation of consciousness, cannabis is capable of nearly the full spectrum of psychedelic effects associated with hallucinogens, end quote. So I thought that was interesting that he says if consumed in a certain way and, following certain sort of procedures, I guess, the effects of marijuana consumption can be similar to those of the hallucinogenic drugs that he speaks about. So, not surprisingly, marijuana's legalization issues, he thinks, likely arise because it threatens dominator culture values. So unlike alcohol, which he suggests is the dominator culture drug par excellence, or however he said it, right? Marijuana is like the opposite, right? There's something about marijuana that doesn't sit well with the dominator culture, right? It's threatening to the dominator culture. So along those lines, he writes, this is pages 154 to 154, let's start there. Quote, the longer hair lengths for men seen with the rise of marijuana use in the United States in the 1960s were a textbook case of an influx of apparently feminine values accompanying the use of a boundary-dissolving plant. So the idea is, right, this longer hair associated with the feminine, right? Again, dominator culture, society, its values are more masculine. That's going to be inherently at odds with that. Later down on page 154, quote, it is the identification, care, and propagation of the female of the species, that is of marijuana, that is the total concern of the grower interested in the narcotic power of the plant. This is because the resin is the exclusive product of the female plant. So that is interesting about marijuana as well, is that only the females of the plant produce the psychoactive effects, right? The males, they don't produce the psychoactive effects. And in fact, I believe they hamper, right? They'll ruin the crop, right? You have to get the males out. So he says, look, that's also kind of, it emphasizes the feminine, So interesting as well. So that was 154. 155, he writes, of all the pandemic plants and toxicants inhabiting the earth, cannabis is second only to mushrooms in its promotion of the social values and sensory ratios that typified the original partnership societies. How else are we to explain the unrelenting persecution of cannabis use in the face of overwhelming evidence that, of all the intoxicants ever used, cannabis is among the most benign? Its social consequences are negligible compared with those of alcohol. Cannabis is an anathema, a curse, I guess, to the dominator culture because it deconditions or decouples users from accepted values. Further down on 155, legalization of marijuana is thus a complex issue, since it involves legitimizing a social factor that might ameliorate or even modify ego-dominant values. And then even further down on 155, society's contempt for the cannabis user is a thinly disguised contempt for the values of community and the feminine. Interesting. So 165 to 166, he says, so this is kind of with respect to the idea that people are going to realize the boons of pot and they're not willing to, or marijuana, and they're not ready to relinquish it because of the good that they see associated with it. Okay, so despite the efforts of prohibition in the government, right, the people know better, he suggests, and they're going to fight for their ability to consume cannabis. So he says, quote, despite all the pressures brought against it, cannabis use rose until today. Cannabis may well be America's single largest agricultural product. This is one of the most persistent aspects of the great paradigm shift that I am here calling the Archaic revival. It indicates that the innate drive to restore the psychological balance typifying the partisanship of society once it finds a suitable vehicle is not easily deterred. Everything about cannabis that makes it inimical to contemporary bourgeoisie values endears it to the archaic revival. It diminishes the power of ego, has a mitigating effect on competitiveness, causes one to question authority, and reinforces the notion of the merely relative importance of social values. No other drug can compete with cannabis for its ability to satisfy the innate yearnings for archaic boundary dissolution and yet leave intact the structures of ordinary society. If every alcoholic were a pothead, if every crack user were a pothead, if every smoker smoked only cannabis, the social consequences of the drug problem would be transformed, end quote. So that's 165 to 166. And I will wrap that up. Idea of marijuana threatening the dominator culture in society and its values. I'll wrap that up, that idea, by quoting 268, what he says there. Quote, I believe that once drugs are legalized, the fear that there will be a vast epidemic of cocaine or heroin addiction will be proven groundless. I also believe that there will be increased interest in and use of psychedelics, and that this possibility is of great concern to the establishment. So hence, that's why it's taking so long, right, for drugs to be legalized, because they are of great concern, right? Their legalization is of great concern to the establishment, to the dominator cultures and societies and the governments, right, that are associated with them. The legalization of marijuana and these other hallucinogens, right, they're threatening to those institutions. So that was 268. So that was part 2, okay, sort of suggesting or discussing how it was that we lost paradise, right? Paradise lost. Moving on then to not only have we lost paradise, but let's talk about hell. Part 3, hell. Moving on to part 3 then, right, where it's gotten really bad, bringing us kind of up to the present moment, if you will. Right? So as I did before, kind of generally describing the subjects that he addresses in this part, right, he's going to continue to detail using the wrong drugs, right, these substitutes for the original psilocybin mushroom. And again, marijuana sort of being and honey, he has a lot of respect for honey as well. Those being the two sort of caveats or exceptions, right? For the most part, all these various drugs that we've attempted to use as substitutes over the years, according to him, right, have not met expectations, right? They haven't brought us to the same ecstatic experience that we originally experienced with these psilocybin mushrooms. So he's going to continue sort of detailing some of these wrong drugs, so to speak. He's going to talk about, so along those lines, sugar. I'll have a lot to say about sugar, coffee and caffeine, heroin as well, cocaine, and I'll have some stuff to say about that. Television, interestingly, he has some reflections on television and has a lot of parallels to draw between these various drugs, the things that we normally associate with drugs, and then television, which he thinks of as a drug in itself. Okay, so the first thing sort of establishes in part 3 is that, okay, we have officially lost our way, and we're now very much entrenched in the dominator culture. There's no denying it, hence we're in hell, right? So the idea of being paradise was the partnership societies and the appreciation of love and respect and constant dwelling on nature and earth. That's completely missing, and in lieu of that, now we have the dominator culture thriving and flourishing, and we're entrenched in that, and it's thriving and flourishing means that we're all suffering, hence hell. We're all experiencing hell, if you will. Okay, so we've lost our way. We're now entrenched in the dominator culture. Supporting that textually, I'll quote 170 here. Quote, dominator culture has never been more powerfully entrenched than in Christian Europe after the eclipse of the Roman Empire. And it's probably safe to say that scarcely ever have human populations existed in such a prolonged situation of drug scarcity and lack of chemical stimulation. Right, so again, the prohibition goes hand in hand with the flourishing and prominence of the dominator cultures and societies. They want to prohibit, for the most part, at least the hallucinogenic drugs that he has in mind. Right, alcohol and some of these other drugs, as we'll see, they'll be okay. Right, but certain ones, they're certainly minimizing our access to and censoring them in some sense. Okay, so that was 170. Page 223. He writes, these repressive episodes in the evolution of Western thought effectively closed the door on communication with the guy in mind. Hierarchical imposed religion and later hierarchical dispensed scientific knowledge were substituted for any sort of direct experience of the mind behind nature. The intoxicants of the Christian dominator culture, whether plants or synthetic drugs, were inevitably stimulants or narcotics, drugs of the workplace, or drugs to dull care and pain. Drugs in the 20th century serve only medical or recreational purposes. Okay, so that's a big theme too, that the drugs that, why is that alcohol is allowed, and permitted, and caffeine is allowed and permitted, but these other, hallucinogenic drugs and marijuana aren't. It's because the certain ones, right, they're good for the workplace, as he says. They help dull care and pain, right, and help basically the technological industrial society that we live in, allow it to run efficiently, right? It's in the best interest of it. And I was, for what it's worth, reminded of Ted Kaczynski and his Unabomber Manifesto and his other writings that you can find in Technological Slavery. A lot of what McKenna argues is going on reminded, in present day dominator cultures and societies, reminded me of what Kaczynski suggests is going on, and our enslavement to sort of these technological corporations. That's part of, McKenna would say, that's part of what's going to happen when the dominator cultures and societies propagate and become as prominent as they are. Okay, so that was 223. So last, I'll move on to 271. There he writes, quote, our breach of faith with the symbiotic relationship to the plant hallucinogens has made us susceptible to an ever more neurotic response to each other and the world around us. Several thousand years of such bereavement have left us the nearly psychotic inheritors of a planet festering with the toxic byproducts of scientific industrialism. Again, very reminiscent of something Kaczynski might say. Okay, so that was 271. So he, as I alluded to at the outset of this discussion in part 3, he talks a lot about sugar. He chronicles the history and recently increasing popularity of sugar. So he talks about that on 173. He says of sugar, quote, of the many new commodities that made their way into Europe during the breakup of the medieval stasis, one in particular emerged as the new spice or drug of choice. This was cane sugar. Okay. That was 173. It has long been used in medicine to make, quote, palatable the foul-tasting mixture of medicinal herbs, entrails, and other materials typical of the medieval pharmacopoeia. 174, he says that. And it's only been recently, though, that it's been used in sort of a dietary sense, if you will. It's highly addictive and certainly worthy of emphasis, he argues. So in that vein, he writes, this is page 175, quote, is it stretching a point to discuss sugar and a history of human drug use? It is not. Sugar abuse is the world's least discussed and most widespread addiction, and it is one of the hardest of all habits to kick. For a little bit further down on 175, as with all stimulants, ingestion of sugar is followed by a brief euphoric rush, which is itself followed by depression and guilt. Sugar addiction rarely occurs alone as a syndrome. Mixed addictions, for example, sugar and caffeine, are more common. And then further down on 175, he writes, sugar abuse is often involved in the development of serious alcohol abuse. After alcohol and tobacco, sugar is the most damaging and addictive substance consumed by human beings. Its uncontrolled use can be a major chemical dependence. Okay, so huge issues associated with sugar, he thinks. Page 178. Quote, if it seems that too much ire is vented on the sugar habit, it is because, in many ways, the addiction to sugar seems a distillation of all the wrong-headed attitudes that attend our thinking about drugs. So he's sort of explaining why he spent so much time demonizing sugar, okay? Because he thinks it, again, it captures, in many ways, how our thinking about these drugs are flawed, right? We let sugar, it's literally in almost everything we eat. It's hugely problematic, nothing really good about it. And in fact, sugar, as he says, quote, sugar is entirely unnecessary to the human diet. Sugar contributes nothing that cannot be gotten from some other easily available source. The ability of the ego-dominated culture to suppress these realities is astonishing. He says that on page 178. So not only, right, is it doing nothing for us, but it's pervasive. It's everywhere. It's in all of our food. And yet at the same time, right, look what's diminished in our culture and not allowed to be known, right? These psilocybin mushrooms, for example, or marijuana, these drugs that actually could lend themselves to help us, right? They could have actually beneficial effects for us, right? They're suppressed, whereas these other terrible drugs like sugar, right, they're allowed to be everywhere, right? They're, like I said, they're in all the food. You know, alcohol's everywhere in our culture. So he's excusing himself for spending so much time deriding sugar, given that that's the case. So I thought that was interesting. That was, again, 178. And I mentioned, or I quoted him saying that basically all of this, despite the fact that sugar is really useless. Not only is it terrible for us, but it doesn't give us anything that we can't get from something else. So also, like alcohol and caffeine, sugar acts as a kind of catalyst for the Dominator society and the inculcation of its values. So no surprise that it's allowed to be put in everything, right? If it's facilitating the prominence of the Dominator societies that sort of are in charge these days. Along those lines, this is page 179. Quote, sugar stands at a watershed in such matters, for sugar and the caffeine drugs that spread with it reinforce and support industrial civilization's unreflecting emphasis on efficiency at the price of archaic human values. And that reflects back on some of the things we talked about, and right, the displacement of these original archaic human values and emphasis on nature with the emphasis on efficiency and whatever is needed for the corporation's profits in general. So that was 179. 183. Quote, through its use in caffeine drinks and distilled alcohol, sugar played a major indirect role in furthering the Dominator culture's suppression of their underclass and of women of all classes. Slavery to drugs is a tired metaphor, but in the case of sugar, the metaphor was made horribly real. So again, that was page 183. So tea, coffee, and other caffeine drinks are also embedded in the Dominator culture, and he elaborates on that and why that is the case. So again, tea, coffee, and other caffeine drinks, they are allowed to exist, and they're not suppressed, they're not prohibited. And so he talks about that. That's pages 184 to 185. He writes, so this is again of those sorts of drugs. It's tea, coffee, caffeine. Quote, their stimulant properties make caffeine and coffee and its close cousin theobromine, and tea the ideal drugs for the Industrial Revolution. They provided an energy lift, enabling people to keep working at repetitious tasks that demanded concentration. Indeed, the tea and coffee break is the only drug ritual that has never been criticized by those who profit from the modern industrial state. Okay, so there's a reason why caffeine in the form of coffee and tea is allowed to be consumed, because it helps with the techno-industrial society. It enables it to flourish and helps corporations profit, essentially. So that was 184 to 185. And he wants to emphasize, look, sugar, caffeine, and the like, these are in fact drugs, despite how weird that seems to some of us, right? Because of how we've been conditioned to think about drugs. He wants to emphasize, look, these things are in fact drugs. Okay? So along those lines, page 15, he writes, going way back to chapter 1, or actually this is chapter 2, he writes, quote, when thinking about drugs, we tend to focus on episodes of intoxication, but many drugs are normally used in sub-threshold or maintenance doses. Coffee and tobacco are obvious examples in our culture. The result of this kind is a kind of ambience of intoxication. Like fish in water, people and cultures swim in the virtually invisible medium of culturally sanctioned yet artificial states of mind. End quote. So he's suggesting that because these are approved and are okay, and because they're not getting us blitzed out of our mind, we become sort of affected by them in sort of an unknown manner, right? We don't kind of appreciate and recognize the degree to which we're actually being affected by some of these substances. And hence we don't appreciate that they are in fact drugs, right? That they are affecting our chemistry and our sense of reality, right? Because again, we're using them in typically small enough doses that they're not, again, making us go out of our minds by any means. And so we lose an appreciation, he's suggesting, for the sense in which they're still drugs and still affecting our sense of reality. So again, that was page 15, 180. So again, with respect to the idea that sugar is a drug, he talked about, quote, our stereotyped notion of what constitutes drugs is strained when we are asked to consider such delicate accessories of bourgeoisie sensibility as tea, coffee, and cocoa as being in the same category as heroin and cocaine, yet all are drugs. Sugar, this is further down on 180, sugar is culturally defined by us as a food. This definition denies that sugar can act as a highly addictive drug, yet the evidence is all around us. Many children and compulsive eaters live in a motivational environment primarily ruled by mood swings resulting from cravings for sugar. And I'll mention this a little bit later, but I think he's ahead of his time, writing this in 1992, ahead of his time in his reflections on sugar and how bad it is for us. Moving on, he talks about opium and tobacco. These are very addictive substances as well and receive a generally negative review on his account. He's not really a fan of, either one of them. But, a lot of what he has to say is with respect to why, again, these two things, while both generally pretty bad, why they have received such radically different receptions in dominator cultures. And it's not going to be a surprise. It's because, tobacco is a stimulant, right? And so lo and behold, right, it's not going to be a surprise that it flourishes in dominator cultures. Even though, right, it seems to be much more dangerous than opium and its derivatives like morphine and heroin. It's arguably, at least, more dangerous. So he seems to be particularly interested in that. Again, why is it that these, at the very least, equally bad substances, why is it the one is treated radically different from the other? So along those lines, page 188 to 189, he says, where is this? Tobacco is no less addicting than the supposed hardest of hard drugs, heroin. What can we learn from the comparison of these two plants? Both have a long history of human usage, both are addictive and ultimately destructive, and yet one is firmly integrated into our lifestyles and sold to us as masculine, sophisticated, pleasurable, while the other is illegal, fiercely suppressed, inveighed against as suicidal, and viewed with an unreflecting horror. This situation is but another example of the hypocrisy of dominator culture, as it picks and chooses the truths and realities that it finds comfortable. The fact is that while heroin is highly addictive, it is nevertheless no more dangerous than its legal and highly touted competitor, tobacco. A little bit further down, so this is from 188 and 189, this is further down on 189. We must look at effects unrelated to the shared property of addiction to understand why dominator society has chosen to suppress one and exalt the other. Okay. So again, that was with respect to opium and tobacco. Why is it that the one is revered? And you got to remember, he was writing this in the early 90s. Cigarettes have garnered a much worse reputation in the interim, right, since he wrote this. But for a long time, why was it that tobacco was held in high regard and opium was kind of the opposite? There's something about tobacco that's endearing to the dominator culture and its values. And that's something about opium that's not the case. So that was 188 to 189. I mentioned earlier that he explores, right, the similarities between television and these other mind-altering substances that we've talked about. And in doing so, I was frequently, when he talked about that, I was frequently reminded of gerrymandered. I mentioned this earlier, the 4 arguments for the elimination of television. A lot of what he said here was very reminiscent of gerrymander and the kind of things he says about television. So what are the sorts of things he says? 218, he writes, so he's describing, actually he starts by describing Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle, and he writes, quote, in Dick's fictional world, the Japanese occupation authorities introduced and legalized marijuana as one of their first moves at pacifying the population of California. Things are hardly less strange here in what conventional wisdom lightheartedly refers to as reality. In this world, too, the victors introduced an all-pervasive, ultra-powerful, society-shaping drug. This drug was the first of a growing group of high-technology drugs that deliver the user into an alternative reality by acting directly on the user's sensorium, without chemicals being introduced into the nervous system. It was television. So the idea, again, is that they introduced television right away to basically facilitate the propaganda that they wanted to, right, to start conditioning the masses. Further down on 218, the nearest analogy to the addictive power of television and the transformation of values that is wrought in the lives of the heavy user is probably heroin. So I thought that was interesting. He equates television and addiction to television. Of course, none of us think we're addicted to television. He equates all of that and the profound effects it has on the user, right? We don't think of ourselves as users, right? But as the profound effects of the viewer of television or the user of television is most similar to, he thinks, the user of heroin and the effects that the heroin user experiences. I thought that was an interesting comparison. 219 to 220, along those lines, he writes, no drug in history has so quickly and completely isolated the entire culture of its users from contact with reality. And no drug in history has so completely succeeded in remaking in its own image the values of the culture that it has infected. Television is by nature the dominator drug par excellence. Control of content, uniformity of content, repeatability of content make it inevitably a tool of coercion, brainwashing, and manipulation. Television induces a trance state in the viewer that is the necessary precondition for brainwashing. Television came along at precisely the right time from the point of view of the dominator elite. Television did its job and created a post-war American culture of the Ken and Barbie variety. The children of Ken and Barbie briefly broke out of the television intoxication in the mid-60s through the use of hallucinogens. Oops, responded the dominators, and they quickly made psychedelics illegal and halted all research. A double dose of TV therapy plus cocaine was ordered up for the errant hippies, and they were quickly cured and turned into consumption-oriented yuppies. Only a recalcitrant few escaped this leveling of values. Nearly everyone learned to love Big Brother, end quote. So that was, again, pages 219 to 220, and a lot of that was reminiscent of, and he actually quotes and references gerrymander, actually, in some of that. A lot of it was reminiscent of what gerrymander says regarding television and how it affects us. So that was part 3, again, talking about how bad it's gotten, elaborates on these various substances that we've used as substitutes for the original magic mushroom and that experience, and talks about why those haven't worked. So moving on then to discuss part 4, titled Paradise Regained. This is where he's then going to become, how do I want to put it, prescriptive and offer possible solutions, right? He doesn't claim to have the answer or answers, but he has suggestions. So as I've done in all the previous parts, to briefly here at the outset discuss the general topics that are addressed here in this part, he's going to detail basically a call to action. He's going to suggest, look, we've got to take action now before it's too late. It's almost too late. Perhaps it arguably is too late. Right? Are we too immersed in the Dominator culture to have an archaic revival? Right? That's up for debate. He says, look, we need a call to action just at the very least in case it's not too late. Right? He talks about the history of psychedelics, and of course we've already been getting into some of that, but he talks about sort of the history of them in general, gives an account of that here in part 4. He talks again about how drug prohibition does not work and how part of the solution is going to be then in turn legalizing these drugs, right? Legalizing nature, if you will. And he ends by offering proposals for action. Further elaborating on his call to action, he's going to offer some proposals for what we ought to do. Okay, so he opens part 4 by discussing New World hallucinogens. So we've kind of lost our archaic relationship that we used to have with nature and earth, and emphasizing that our love for it. We lost that by way of in the process of losing our relationship with these magic mushrooms. Okay, so there's been a long time period then where we seem to have been divorced. Then, right, we've lost paradise. We've lost these magic mushrooms. But then he talks about how there are these new world hallucinogens. Are we rediscovering? Right? Is this maybe a way to regain, as he says, paradise? Right? There are these so-called new world hallucinogens. So hallucinogens that exist nowadays, right, in this so-called new world. Right, so in particular, the ones we're going to focus on, that he seems to focus on, DMT or dimethyltryptamine and ayahuasca, which, what is ayahuasca? And not that we're going to become too technically nuanced here, that it's that important for us, but ayahuasca is actually, it incorporates DMT-containing plants so DMT-containing plants plus plants that contain MAO inhibitors. So ayahuasca is sort of a combination, right, of DMT-containing plants and then also plants that contain what are known as MAO inhibitors. And I know that's abbreviation for something medical. Again, I don't know the details there. And so what these MAO inhibitor plants help do is they inhibit and help activate the DMT when it's consumed orally. Otherwise, right, if you didn't have these MAO inhibitor plants included in the ayahuasca, if that wasn't part of it, then we wouldn't be able to feel the effects of the DMT plants orally. We could still smoke them and then experience the DMT, but otherwise consuming them orally would have no effect. So with respect to ayahuasca, what it does, or why it works, is it has both. It has the DMT-consuming plants and then also these MAO inhibitor plants, which, again, allow us to activate the DMT orally, whereas otherwise it wouldn't be activated. And I've heard, so he claims, and I've heard that the DMT, this dimethyltryptamine, is the most powerful of all hallucinogens. So along those lines, he writes, page 236, in 1956, the Czech chemist Stephen Sarza synthesized dimethyltryptamine, DMT. DMT remains the most powerful of all hallucinogens and one of the most short-acting of these compounds known. When DMT is smoked, the intoxication reaches a peak in about 2 minutes and then abates over about 10 minutes. So that's really interesting to note. DMT is the most powerful of all hallucinogens. When smoked, which is arguably one of the main ways it's consumed, right? Maybe the most common. It only lasts like 10 minutes, and yet it has this significant, profound effect. and it can be consumed orally in the form of ayahuasca because ayahuasca contains other types of plants which allow the DMT containing plants to become activated when we consume them orally. So that's how ayahuasca works. I don't know how clear that was, but not that it's super important to the nuances of ayahuasca and DMT and so on. Not that that's too important to a lot of what we're going to say here. But I wanted to try to articulate what those are, what those substances are. And he again has a lot to say about DMT in general, and then ayahuasca, which he consumed, which again is containing DMT and it's taken orally. So when you consume ayahuasca, the big difference then is it's acting orally because of those other plants that are involved, and it lasts a lot longer than, I don't remember specifically what he said, but like hours and hours and hours. So it goes from being one of the shortest drug experiences, if you will, 10 minutes if it's smoked, to I want to say like almost a day, right? Hours and hours and hours if it's taken orally by way of ayahuasca. So he concedes, while conceding that we don't yet know what the long-term effects of these New World hallucinogens are, he concedes that we don't necessarily know what their effects are going to be on mental and physical health. He concedes all that. He says, nevertheless, his personal experiences leave him convinced of their sacredness and their efficacy. He thinks that eventually, in due time, it'll probably be borne out that they're actually great for us. So along those lines, page 228 and 229, he says, quote, the impact of long-term use of hallucinogenic indoles on mental and physical health is not yet well understood. My own experiences among the Mestizo populations of Amazonians convince me that the long-term effect of ayahuasca use is an extraordinary state of health and integration. On page 229, he continues, quote, often these methods exhibit startling parallels to the techniques of modern psychotherapy. At other times, they seem to represent an understanding of possibilities and energies still unrecognized by Western theories of healing. A little bit further down in 229, the chief lesson to be learned from the psychedelic experience is the degree to which unexamined cultural values and limitations of language have made us the unwitting prisoners of our own assumptions. For it cannot be without reason that wherever in the world hallucinogenic indoles have been utilized, their use has been equated with magical self-healing and regeneration. The low incidence of serious mental illness among such populations is well documented. So, again, a lot of positives, he thinks, can be associated with the consumption of DMT, of ayahuasca, and those are the new world hallucinogens that he's discussing. Just like there was a lot of positives associated with the old world hallucinogen, the psilocybin magic mushroom, he thinks there's a lot of positives to be gleaned again from these new world hallucinogens, this DMT, this ayahuasca, and so on. Okay, so that was that. I'm not going to say too much about, he talks about mescaline as well. I mentioned earlier that, Aldous Huxley and The Doors of Perception, I believe he was under the influence of mescaline when he wrote that. That comes from the peyote cactus. McKenna does address mescaline, has some things to say about that. He discusses, in particular, right, the 19th and 20th century exploration of mescaline. That's when it became, was discovered and was really explored for the first time then. He also then discusses, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this either, but Albert Hoffman, who more of us are probably familiar with, he accidentally discovered LSD in 1943. A lot of us are probably familiar with that story. But, as McKenna mentions, Hoffman also played a role in the pharmacological study of psilocybin, or psilocybin mushrooms as well, which directly then preceded the turbulent 60s. So, in view of that, he writes, this is a quote from 237, the chemical loose ends of the Watson's discoveries were tidied up by Albert Hoffman, who made a second starring appearance in the history of psychedelic pharmacology by chemically isolating psilocybin and determining its structure in 1958. In the short space of a dozen years in the recent past, from 1947 until 1960, the major indole hallucinogens were characterized, purified, and investigated. It is no coincidence that the subsequent decade was the most turbulent decade in America in 100 years. So again, that was 237. And he thinks LSD speaks to the power and role of hallucinogenic drugs, I should say, in fostering love and consciousness and sort of engendering partnership societies in a sense, um, in facilitating a kind of archaic revival, if you will, and then a renewed appreciation and love for nature and the earth. And in some sense, kind of an awareness and rejection of conditions that are antithetical to that sort of thing, right? So he thinks like LSD and some of these new world hallucinogens, they can help wake us up, if you will. So also in 237, he writes, quote, to understand the role of psychedelics in the 1960s, we must recall the lessons of prehistory and the importance to early human beings of the dissolution of boundaries in group ritual based on ingestion of hallucinogenic plants. The compounds act to dissolve cultural conditioning of any sort. Such compounds should be recognized as deconditioning agents. Further down, he writes, the sudden introduction of a powerful deconditioning agent such as LSD had the effect of creating a mass defection from community values, especially values based on a dominator hierarchy accustomed to suppressing consciousness and awareness. So he's suggesting LSD kind of woke us up to the fact that we were being, suppressed. Our consciousness was being suppressed, right, in certain ways, thanks to the dominator culture. And it led to sort of a backlash, right? And so then it's going to be no surprise then that the dominator culture is going to react to this by prohibiting, right, and suppressing LSD and other New World hallucinogens. So threatened by such mind-altering substances, these dominator cultures immediately started making them categorically illegal right after the 60s. So he talks about that process. So page 240, he writes, quote, all psychedelic drugs, even such unknowns as ibogaine and bufotenin, were made illegal. A relentless restructuring of values was begun in the West. Throughout the 70s and 80s, the need to deny the impact of the 60s took on something of the flavor of a mass obsession. As the 70s progressed, the new management agenda became clear. While heroin had lost some of its glamour, now there was to be television for the poor and cocaine for the rich. The new era, this is further down on 240, the new era of repression came despite the fact that a number of researchers were using LSD to cure conditions previously considered untreatable. And so LSD was doing all sorts of great things. Researchers were using LSD to do all sorts of great things, and yet it was simultaneously beginning to be suppressed and prohibited. So that was 240. 244, he writes, quote, the 1980s were an era unusually empty of developments in the area of psychedelics. Synthetic amphetamines such as MDA were sporadically available from the early 1970s on, and during the 1980s, MDMA, or ecstasy, appeared in significant amounts. MDA in particular showed promise when used with directed psychotherapy, but these drugs were quickly made illegal and forced underground. What cannot be contained are the effects that psychedelics would have in shaping the cultural self-image if all drugs were legal and available. This is the hidden issue that makes governments unwilling to consider legalization. The unmanaged shift of consciousness that legal and available drugs, including plant psychedelics, would bring is extremely threatening to a dominator, ego-oriented culture, end quote. So he's, again, documenting, detailing, and elaborating on the reasons for the prohibition and suppression of and censorship of these certain drugs, these hallucinogenic drugs. Okay. So that was 244. 245, he writes, an interrupted psychophysical symbiosis between ourselves and the visionary plants and the unrecognized cause, is the unrecognized cause, let me start over. An interrupted psychophysical symbiosis between ourselves and the visionary plants is the unrecognized cause of the alienation of modernity and the cultural mindset of planetary civilization. A worldwide attitude of fear towards drugs is being fostered and manipulated by the dominator culture and its propaganda organs. Vast illicit fortunes continue to be made. Government continues to wring its hands. This is but the most recent effort to profiteer from and frustrate our species' deeply instinctual need to make contact with the Gaian mind of the living planet. So again, he's elaborating on the sort of corporate nature of the dominator culture and how it's interested in divorcing us again from our relationship with and emphasis on nature and earth. So that was page 245. And I alluded to this before, but the last chapter, it's called Anticipating the Archaic Paradise, offers his advice and prescriptions then for moving forward, given the gloomy reality of the situation. Right? So how shall we proceed? How does he proceed, at least at that time? So interestingly, he suggests that he avoids synthetics and prefers organic hallucinogens. So clearly he wants a revival of the archaic, an archaic revival. Now it's going to involve then revisiting our relationship to these hallucinogenic plants and presumably using them, consuming them, indulging in them. And so he says in part then that, when it comes to that, he avoids synthetics and prefers organic hallucinogens. So he talks about that on page 247. He says, quote, I have not mentioned any synthetics because I would prefer to separate the vision-producing plants from the popular notion of drugs. I avoid synthetic drugs and prefer the organic hallucinogens because I believe that a long history of shamanic usage is the first seal of approval that one must look for when selecting a substance for its possible effects on personal growth. And if a plant has been used for thousands of years, one can also be fairly confident that it does not cause tumors or miscarriages or carry other unacceptable physical risks. Over time, trial and error has resulted in the choice of the most effective and least toxic plants for shamanic use. End quote. So he again is associating these organic hallucinogens with the ones that the shamans use, right? The psilocybin mushrooms, DMT, and so on, and suggesting that he's going to go with those because they've worked for thousands of years, right? And as has been verified by the fact that shamans have continually used them, and seemingly the societies, the primitive societies in which these shamans exist, they've flourished without mental health issues and so on for thousands of years, he says. So that is his explanation for why he goes with these organic hallucinogens that are popular amongst the shamans and avoids the synthetics, right, that are more common and popular nowadays in the Dominator culture society. So he specifically recommends psilocybin and DMT, no surprise there, for the archaic revival. Along those lines, on 259, he writes, basically suggesting DMT is miraculous. Quote, the extraordinary ease with which DMT utterly destroys all boundaries and conveys one into an impossible to anticipate and compellingly other dimension is one of the miracles of life itself. And so a little bit later on page 259, this time switching focus to psilocybin, he writes, although psilocybin and psilocin, the hallucinogenic indoles, active in the cattle associated with Stropharia cubensis mushrooms, are not presently thought to directly metabolize into DMT before becoming active in the brain, their pathway is the closest of relatives to the neural pathway of DMT activity. So he's saying it doesn't seem to be on par with DMT, right? But it's very close. It seems to be very closely related. What's going on neurologically when we consume psilocybin mushrooms, right? What's going on neurologically, and when we consume those seems to be very similar to the kinds of things that are going on neurologically when we consume DMT. Okay, so he's a big proponent of both of those and discusses those again on page 259. I thought this was kind of interesting, because a lot of this is, and I'll mention this in a little bit, a lot of this is going to rest on, how convincing this stuff is, in his arguments. How convincing they seem to people, I think, is going to rest on sort of whether the person he's trying to convince has themselves had experience of these hallucinogenic drugs. It's going to, I think, matter, right? And because a lot of it otherwise, like the way he describes, I mean, if you haven't actually participated and indulged in these sorts of experiences yourself, I mean, it can seem a little, out there, so to speak. And so I just kind of thought it funny then when he's trying to describe, especially if you're a layman and you've never had this sort of experience, it's in a way kind of humorous to hear him then describing what is in some way ineffable, what you can't really describe. You have to actually have the experience, right? But he nevertheless, the whole point here is he does try to sort of describe what the psychedelic experience is like, right? And in doing so kind of establishes how sacred and in some sense ineffable it really is. So in view of that, he writes on page 249, By whatever route the indole hallucinations are triggered, their full unfolding is impressive indeed. Bizarre ideas, often hilariously funny, curious insights, some seeming almost godlike in their profundity, shards of memories, and free-form hallucinations all clamor for attention. In the state of hallucinogenic intoxication, creativity is not something that one expresses, although it is something that one observes, right? So he thinks that, under the influence of hallucinogens, you are creative, but you're also like experiencing, another whole sort of realm of reality, if you will, right? And that's kind of a creative process in itself. And so further on page 257, 258, he also, again, tries to describe the DMT experience, a very difficult thing to be sure. There he writes, beginning on 252, quote, early in this chapter, DMT was singled out as being of particular interest. A little bit lower. The experience that engulfs one's entire being as one slips beneath the surface of the DMT ecstasy feels like the penetration of a membrane. The mind and the self literally unfold before one's eyes. There is a sense that one is made new. And then on the next page, under the influence of DMT, the world becomes an Arabian labyrinth, a palace, a more than possible Martian jewel, vast with motifs that flood the gaping mind with complex and worldless awe. There is a sense of other times and of one's own infancy and of wonder, and more wonder. Down the page further, many diminutive beings are present there. The tykes, the self-transforming machine elves of hyperspace. One has the impression of entering into an ecology of souls that lies beyond the portals of what we naively call death. I do not know. The sense of emotional connection is terrifying and intense. I believe that what we experience in the presence of DMT is real news. It is a nearby dimension, frightening, transformative, and beyond our powers to imagine, and yet to be explored in the usual way. End quote. So that was 257 to 258. And I'm reminded of, again, Joe Rogan, who I referenced at the beginning of the episode, who, he's done DMT and just tries to describe what it's like. And he talks about McKenna and how McKenna had talked about when under the influence of DMT, encountering and experiencing these tykes or machine elves or other sort of beings in this other dimension. And Rogan, who also has done DMT, then talks about how he also encounters and experiences and interacts with these same sorts of beings. And what's interesting, and I can't remember where I came across this, was it maybe in the book itself? I can't remember if it was in the book or some of the research I was doing. But, they've done research, and people, under the influence of DMT, they report many of the same experiences. For example, encountering these, what McKenna calls machine elves or tykes or whatever name you want to describe them by. Many people describe encountering such beings, and not only encountering them, but describe a similar sort of reaction on the part of these beings. And what is that reaction? Well, sort of kind of annoyance oftentimes that the person's there, but nonetheless they seem willing to help and kind of amused by the presence of the person under the influence of DMT. So these are the common sorts of things that are reported. And if I recall correctly, during the research, they were actually having them report as they were engaging in the experience. So it was really interesting that this, it's not some just sort of kooky ramblings of somebody on drugs, right? I mean, in some sense it is, but what I'm getting at is there seems to be something objective about it, which I think, McKenna would agree with, in the sense that, so many people seem to be offering and accessing the same sorts of experiences and then offering a similar account of them. I think that's at least, very noteworthy. So that was 257, 258. I made this already sort of evident, but, the Archaic revival, which he's all about, when to get rid of this Dominator culture and societies and, revert back to the Archaic way of doing things. That's going to call for a legalization of all psychedelic plants, if not all drugs in general, and then the renewal of our relationship to Earth and nature and worshiping, Mother Earth, the goddess, or however you want to put it, right? An emphasis more on the feminine. We need to revert back to that sort of mentality and way of doing things. So along those lines, page 265, he says, plants are the missing link in the search to understand the human mind and its place in nature. So we can't lose sight of that. At the foundation of the American theory of social polity is the notion that our inalienable rights include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To pretend that the right to the pursuit of happiness does not include the right to experiment with psychoactive plants and substances is to make an argument that is at best narrow and at worst ignorant and primitive. The living fact of the mystery of being is there. This is at the very, this is actually further down on page 270, and this is actually how he ends the book. So he writes, the living fact of the mystery of being is there, and it is an inalienable religious right to be able to approach it on one's own terms. A civilized society would enshrine that principle in law, right? A civilized society would sort of obviously legalize this and allow it to be something that everyone is permitted to engage in. So that's actually how he ended the book itself. There's an epilogue afterwards, but so that was page 270. And then quoting from the epilogue, 272, what do we need to do? We need to revert back to, again, that sort of partnership society and culture and the values associated with that. He writes, the question is, do we have the capacity to change ourselves, to change our minds? I believe that the answer to this must be yes, but not without help from nature. Help from nature means recognizing that the satisfaction of the religious impulse comes not from ritual, and still less from dogma, but rather from a fundamental kind of experience, the experience of symbiosis with hallucinogenic plants, and through them, symbiosis with the whole of planetary life. Right, so again, we need to revert back to kind of the old ways, how it was when we originally consumed, or he thinks, when human beings originally consumed magic mushrooms. And, the sort of symbiotic relationship that emerged. We talked about all the, at least what he suggested, the boons of consuming the magic mushrooms for human beings, the expansion of consciousness, and so on. So that was 272. 274, also in the epilogue, he writes, quote, paradise is our birthright and can be claimed by any one of us. Nature is not our enemy, to be raped and conquered. Nature is ourselves, to be cherished and explored. Shamanism has always known this, and shamanism has always, in its most authentic expressions, taught that the path required allies. These allies are the hallucinogenic plants and the mysterious teaching entities, luminous and transcendental, that reside in that nearby dimension of ecstatic beauty and understanding that we have denied until it is now nearly too late. Speaking of that, is it too late? That, is really the question that looms large at the end of the book and during the epilogue, right? Are we too far gone? Are we lost in a consumer society and addicted to toxic substances? Are too many of us? Is that the case for too many of us? That might be an issue. And he speaks to that, 265. He writes, not to know one's true identity is to be a mad, disensouled thing. And indeed, this image, sickeningly Orwellian, applies to the mass of human beings now living in the high-tech industrial democracies. Their authenticity lies in their ability to obey and follow mass-style changes that are conveyed through media. Immersed in junk food, trash media, and crypto-fascist politics, they are condemned to toxic lives of low awareness. Sedated by the prescripted daily television fix, they are living dead, lost to all but the act of consuming. I believe that the failure of our civilization to come to terms with the issue of drugs and habitual destructive behavior is a legacy of unhappiness for us all. Right, and so again, if it's not too late, right, he's all about and preaches the archaic revival, reverting back as much as possible to partnership societies and cultures and the values associated with them, right? An emphasis on the feminine, on earth and nature. I can't reiterate enough how much, again, I'm reminded of Kaczynski and a lot of his writings when reading McKenna. But again, are we too far gone? That's a question Kaczynski wonders about too, and that's why he's thinks it's so urgent that we revolt against the system as soon as possible, before it is, obviously we're too far gone. But they both kind of wonder, maybe it's the case that we are too far gone. Who knows? Okay, that's it. Hopefully you're still with me, and it wasn't necessarily pretty all the way through. I know I stumbled here and there, but a lot of coverage, textual coverage, involved in the discussion of what the book was about, and we covered it pretty thoroughly. Hopefully you enjoyed it and got a good sense of what McKenna was up to. Now I'll move on to then my thoughts, of which I have quite a few. And as I alluded to in the beginning of the episode, I have sort of what I would call maybe more philosophical reflections, and then I have some more general thoughts. And so I'll begin by kind of getting into the more real philosophical reflections that I have on what McKenna says, and then I'll end this section of my thoughts by discussing some more general musings. Okay, so first, some philosophical thoughts, and let me just begin by saying that very thought-provoking. That's one of the reasons why, again, I took so much time stewing over what he had to say before ultimately recording the episode. There was a lot to think about, and I enjoyed doing so. So one question I had, let me just say, I guess, as I was reading through this is, look, if the stoned ape theory is correct, why aren't other species, experiencing the same sort of evolutionary development or evolution? Like, surely, and I'm pretty sure, and again, it's been a while since I've read it, it's been a few months, but I even think he talked about, other species consuming these magic mushrooms. So if that's the case, if these other species are consuming these same magic mushrooms, why is it that we're the only ones that develop the extraordinary language capacities that are supposedly, right, that he associates with these magic mushrooms, right, that are supposedly associated with these magic mushrooms? McKenna, why is it the case that these other creatures who have consumed these same magic mushrooms, why haven't they developed the same sort of linguistic capacities then? Why haven't they experienced the same sort of consciousness expansion that we have? Because he's attributing it to the magic mushrooms, right, and us eating them. Well, again, presumably some of these other species have done the same. Why haven't we seen the same sort of evolution with them? I couldn't help but kind of wonder about that. So I just wanted to mention that. Another interesting thing is, so his ultimate takeaway from the transcendent psychedelic experience, or from the psychedelic experience, let's put it that way. His ultimate takeaway, what's really going on? What is the shaman? What does he or she actually have access to, or what are we given access to by way of these hallucinogenic plants? What's really going on? And his ultimate takeaway that this psychedelic experience, basically the ultimate takeaway is that, quote, we are facing either a thinking other, right, that lies in some sort of other dimension, or the deep structures of the psyche are made suddenly visible. So he says that on page 250 again. What are the options? What is this transcendent experience indicative of ultimately? Either that we're being included in on some sort of other intelligence or thinking sort of entity out there, or he says it's revealing some sort of deep structures of our psyche that we're not normally included in on. And I could, one of the things that I immediately wondered at this is, why can't it be both? Why can't it be that we're sort of being included into things that we always have access to, but for some reason aren't? Maybe this psychedelic experience is allowing access to that sort of part of our psyche. And then why can't it be then also the case at the same time that this is part of what it means to experience the other, or is in itself indicative of the existence of the other, right? However we want to think about the other. And again, part of what we mean by it is it's ineffable. We can't really describe it, right? But why can't it be both? Right? Why can't it be suggestive of access to something in our neurobiology, right? These drugs are giving us access to something that's there, right? Including us in on something that was always there. It's like putting in the key and unlocking that. Why can't that be happening, and at the same time, right, it being a sort of clue that there is some sort of other existing, right? And maybe ultimately responsible for what's happening to us. I don't know how clear that was, but anyway, those are his kind of two options that he suggests. The psychedelic experience sort of makes him think is the case, right? And that my immediate reaction was, again, why couldn't I agree? Maybe both of these are the psychedelic experience is suggestive of both of these, but why can't it be suggestive of both at the same time? He seemed to present it as an either or, and I'm not necessarily convinced it has to be. But that's a minor point. 261 and 262, he kind of further elaborates on that idea of the other. So there he writes, quote, and this is again at the very end, I wish to stoke the fire slightly by adding the concept of some kind of interdimensional nexus that is gained most reliably and directly through the use of indole hallucinogens with a long history of human usage and human coevolution. On the next page he writes, so 262, quote, I offer these ideas in a speculative vein. I have no strong personal intuition as to what is going on. What is going on inside the DMT intoxication is much more peculiar than anything anyone ever dreamed could be covered by the term intoxication. When intoxicated by DMT, the mind finds itself in a convincingly real, apparently coexisting alien world. End quote. So that again speaks to that idea, right? That especially comes out with this discussion of DMT, that there is we're gaining access to some sort of other dimension, right? However you want to try to describe it. And I mentioned again that users of DMT are all, not all, but many of them, right, a seemingly significant proportion of them are reporting similar experiences and access to similar dimensions, if you will, and similar beings in these other dimensions. And it's very convincingly real to those who actually experience it. As kooky as it might sound to those who haven't experienced it, and as he thought it seemed when he hadn't experienced it for himself, again, you experience it for yourself and it seems very real, he suggests. And Joe Rogan suggests the same thing, right? That he thinks, if I recall correctly, right, that it is indicative of some element of reality that we don't usually have access to, right? And so call that the other, call it whatever you will. What else do I have here? One thing I'm used about, so while reading this is, you're constantly, so supposedly, right, if McKenna can be believed, consuming these plants, and particularly magic mushrooms, has done a lot for us, but what do the plants have to gain from this process of intoxicating us, right? Why do they have these kind of psychoactive properties and the chemicals they do in the first place that are able to afford such a diverse range of effects on us? Why is it that they have these psychoactive properties? And McKenna actually speaks to the same curiosity. So he writes on page 40, in the light of their suggested importance for human evolution, it is natural to inquire what mutagens and other secondary byproducts are actually doing for the plants in which they occur. This is a botanic mystery that remains controversial among evolutionary biologists even today. It has been suggested that toxic and bioactive compounds are produced in plants in order to make them unpalatable and hence undesirable as food. It has also been suggested, conversely, that such compounds were developed to attract insects or birds that pollinate or distribute seeds. So a little bit further down, alkaloids, including all the hallucinogens discussed here, are not inert end products in the plants in which they occur, but are in a dynamic state, fluctuating in both concentration and in their rate of metabolic decay. The role of these alkaloids in the chemistry of metabolism makes it clear that they are essential to the life of the survival strategy of the organism, but they are acting in ways that we do not yet understand. So there's kind of a mystery. What he's suggesting there is there does seem to be something essential about them having these properties. It's not only affecting us in certain ways and seemingly significantly good ways, but it seems to be doing something for the plants as well, but it's still a big mystery. It is his suggestion there. I will say that I like his notion that nature has intelligence. throughout you kind of get that vibe that, right, that nature's sort of like steering things through by emitting these chemicals in certain ways and having them produce these certain effects. It's sort of steering how things are happening, and in a way that's a kind of intelligence. And I like that kind of notion. I'd never really associated intelligence with nature. I know that others have probably, and that's not a new thing, but it's not something that what I mean to say is it's not something that I've given a lot of thought to. But I like, again, how he sort of expands on that idea. Could it be then that nature is exhibiting a kind of chemical intelligence that goes generally unrecognized by the masses, by most of us, most of the time? I don't know. Maybe it is the case. Again, why are these plants? Why is it that they have these properties? Just kind of interesting and mysterious. Page 40 to 41, he writes. So, why is it that they have, in response to kind of the question, why is it that they have these properties? One possibility, he says, quote, some of these compounds may be exopheromones. Exopheromones are chemical messengers that do not act among the members of a single species, but instead act across species lines, so that an individual influences members of a different species. Some exopheromones act in ways that allow a small group of individuals to affect a community or an entire biome. The notion of nature as an organismic and planetary whole that mediates and controls its own development through the release of chemical messages may seem somewhat radical. And again, it's not something I've given a lot of thought about. Page 41, he continues, if hallucinogens function as interspecies chemical messengers, then the dynamic of the close relationship between primate and hallucinogenic plant is one of information transfer from one species to the other. Where plant hallucinogens do not occur, such transfers of information take place with great slowness. But in the presence of hallucinogens, a culture is quickly introduced to ever more novel information, sensory input, and behavior, and thus is bootstrapped to higher and higher states of self-reflection. I call this encounter with the transcendent other. I call this the encounter with the transcendent other. But this is only a label, not an explanation. From one point of view, the transcendent other is nature correctly perceived to be alive and intelligent. So, again, very fascinating sort of perspective there. That was pages 40 to 41. Is nature alive and intelligent in a way that we don't normally think of it as being? I think he's maybe onto something there. I wanted to move on then and give some general reflections here. So, let me begin by saying that this is probably true of a lot of you if you grew up at a similar time, if you're similar in age. Let me begin by saying that having grown up in the midst of the DARE frenzy, in the early 90s especially, where I was repeatedly told, drugs are bad, right? Don't do drugs, et cetera, you come from that sort of environment, growing up in that environment, and read this kind of book, and it's just like, whoa, right? It immediately struck me in many ways as, I'd say almost revolutionary, and it's certainly against the norm, especially for that time period, 1992. So, yeah, I would say in general, very sort of thought-provoking, right? Unique. Terence McKenna, his theories and this book in particular they're certainly one of a kind and unique. And honestly, that's always been something that's appealed to me. I'm always looking for unique people, unique theories, things that are different, right? What are some theories that I haven't heard before? And honestly, a lot of what he says is unique. I hadn't really, maybe that's just me. Maybe that's not the case it wouldn't be the case for most people who read it. But a lot of what he talks about, I hadn't really thought about before, and at least in the way that he talks about these topics, and I appreciate that. So that's definitely one of the huge positives I would associate with the book. And so he's definitely revolutionary. Not afraid. He evidently is a maverick of sorts. Not afraid to go against the norm. I have a lot of respect, I think, for him. Given again the time. given that he has so much appreciation and advocates for these drugs, and given how much they've been suppressed and how difficult, right, given the time it would be to make such views known, I have a lot of respect for him for nevertheless being vocal about his views and being honest about such views, right? That couldn't have been easy for him. I mentioned this earlier, but I also appreciate how he admonishes us about certain negative effects of certain substances, seemingly long before we were warned about them by, publicly, or before they were maligned publicly. So I mentioned sugar, right? I don't really remember sugar. Sugar is bad. That being that much of an emphasis back in the early 90s. But he talks extensively again about how really terrible sugar is, right? So I have some respect for him in that sense as well, right? Being, at least in my mind, was an early sort of proponent of sugar is bad. I also have to say the book, so a general sort of reflection, it's extremely well sourced and referenced. The index is very extensive, right? The notes for each chapter are very extensive. So it's an academic work, to be sure. I could see courses being taught on this book, an entire course being taught on this book. I'm surprised, honestly, that there hasn't been more attention devoted to this, and that the only way I really heard about this book was by way of Joe Rogan. Like, how is that the case? I mean, it's not just that he has unique ideas, but it's that, he defends them in a very thorough way. Like I said, it's a very academic work, and well sourced, and he backs up his arguments. And, you may not agree with him, but he provides, evidence for his case at least, right? And so you have to hand him that, I think. And what's really appreciable to me, and I've talked about this with respect to other books, other authors that are like this, it's that it's not only it's an academic work where he's advancing, arguments in a very thorough and academic manner, but he does so in a very accessible way nonetheless. And that is a difficult thing to achieve, I think. So I think it speaks to his ability as a writer. So I would almost say he's a genius when it comes to his capacity or ability as a thinker, right? In the sense that look at all the different things that are unique that he's thought about, or ways of thinking about things that are unique, right? That speaks to his ability as a thinker. But then also, he's a great writer because he's able to talk about these things in a way where he defends his positions, right, in an academic sense, very thoroughly, and yet he's able to convey these arguments and his points in a way that's accessible even to laymen, right, to the average everyday person. You don't have to be that studious I don't think anyway, to understand a lot of what he's saying. I mean, some of it's dense, sure, and some of it you're going to run into ample words that you don't know, right? That's for sure the case, but I think anybody honestly could pretty much get what he's getting at, in general at least. I think that is the mark of a really good writer. And I know I've spoken about that in previous episodes, but McKenna certainly not only a good thinker in my mind, but also a good writer. So that's that. Mention some of those words that you'll encounter that you don't know. There will be some of those, and I have to say I do appreciate that he included a dictionary at the end, a glossary as he calls it, where he defines some of the more nuanced and specialized jargon that he uses. Gaia, and what was the other one I was thinking of earlier? Ayahuasca, he defines mutagen, partnership, society, symbiosis, and so on. That was very helpful, I thought. I mentioned this earlier, just a general reflection, I'll reiterate it again. I think the degree to which his readers are going to be open to and perhaps even agree with the things he says regarding hallucinogens is going to hinge on whether or not they themselves, right, the readers, whether or not they themselves have consumed them, right? In which case they'll be able to better identify with the ineffable, right? That psychedelic experience that is so hard to describe, right? And he recognizes this point. He makes a similar point himself: the difficulties of his being able to, the difficulties associated with being able to convey his points to maybe people who aren't, who haven't shared that same sort of experience, right? It's going to be more difficult, and he appreciates that. He, ruminates on some of this when he's discussing his take on DMT. There he insists, quote, "I do not expect my words to be taken at face value." This is with respect to DMT. "Nevertheless, these conclusions are based on an experience available to anyone who will but take the time to investigate DMT." End quote, page 264 there. Right, so yeah, it can be difficult, right, to convey and maybe convince some people who haven't, engaged in similar experiences, haven't experienced these psychedelic experiences. But nevertheless, right, it's ultimately open to them to try it, and then they will be, the suggestion seems to be, right, they will then be able to better relate to a lot of the points he brings up. But, so go out and consume those magic mushrooms before you, really deliver a verdict on whether or not you agree with, his theories. I'll say it's kind of like, I think, one or two last things here. I guess maybe this is the last general reflection I have, and that's that if you like the subject of psychedelics and the things we've gotten into here and the effects of these various hallucinogenic drugs, if you like that topic, by all means, you should check out Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia, which I discovered coincidentally and ironically, I guess, for about the same time I was finishing up McKenna's book. And I discovered that and thoroughly enjoyed so it's Hamilton Morris is the guy that does the episodes. And I thoroughly enjoyed the episodes then. And it's reminiscent of reading McKenna, I think. So if you liked, again, if you were familiar with McKenna, if you liked our discussion of McKenna in this episode, you might be interested again in checking out Hamilton Morris's Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia, where he talks a lot about himself. Each episode he takes a look at one of the hallucinogenic drugs. All kinds of different ones, ketamine, so on and so forth. He'll have episodes where he dives in and discusses each of them and goes out in the world and finds, oftentimes shamans and other peoples who and take in these various hallucinogenic drugs. So it's a fascinating series, and I highly recommend it again if you found what we discussed today interesting. Okay, believe it or not, we're finally ready to move on to our book musings grade. It's probably pretty obvious at this point, if you stuck with me and heard the entire episode up to this point, that I'm a big fan of this book. Right? So does it make the Book Musings Hall of Fame? Does it make the highly coveted top shelf of the Book Musings Hall of Fame? Let's find out, right? Let's discuss this Book Musings grade. So, again, obviously a big fan, probably pretty obvious at this point. There are so many things I find appealing about this book, how well sourced and researched it is. I'm an academic, what can I say? That kind of thing appeals to me. The variety of interesting topics it addresses, I've alluded to that already. Right? I'm just so fascinated by so many of the different things he's talked about. The honesty and courage with which he has to proceed in discussing some of those things. I was mentioning that a moment ago, right? It couldn't have been easy to publish this in 1992, right? In the midst of the DARE phenomenon, and it was I remember growing up, right, and experiencing the DARE program. Drugs are bad, right? That was the mantra of seemingly everybody at the time. So to write and then publish this sort of book with the sort of views that he articulates therein, it takes a degree of courage, I think. So I appreciate that. And I guess I would say again, piggybacking on what I was saying a moment ago, right? Among all the things that appeal to me, the thing that appeals to me the most is the uniqueness of his theories, right, and the originality of them. It's just I'd never thought of, our evolution as perhaps including, the consumption of magic mushrooms and those playing such a significant role in our evolution. So that's, that in itself is fascinating. And then to hear all his various reflections on all these different substances, each of his takes on each of these substances, those were fascinating. So I guess above all else, I really liked how original and novel the book seemed, and all the different topics. I just love to dive into each of them. So liked a lot of what was going on there. I wanted to mention how, unlike a lot of other critical philosophy that elaborates and expounds on what's wrong with things, oftentimes when you come across such philosophy, it's just all bad, right? What's wrong with everything as it is? Well, unlike a lot of that, he expounds on a lot of what's bad, but then he, again, towards the end, especially part 4 and especially the chapters at the very end and the epilogue, he offers some reasons for hope and offers some suggestions for how to proceed. Right? So I thought that was another boon, right? Another good thing, at least in my mind. So he actually makes 10 specific proposals for action at the very end of the last chapter. So those are on 269 and 270. 10, actual very specific proposals. So just from the first one, 200% federal tax should be imposed on tobacco and alcohol. And that's not alone. Number 2, so he elaborates on that in number 1. But number 2, all forms of cannabis should be legalized, and a 200% federal sales tax imposed on cannabis products, which I found kind of interesting, or maybe a little odd, given all the things he thinks are great about cannabis. Why have such an seemingly exorbitant tax associated with it? But anyway, at least he offers 10 specific proposals for action, right? Here's what we can at least try to do to make things better. So what is the book Musings grade going to be? I'm going to give Food of the Gods by Terence McKenna an A. Accordingly, Food of the Gods has made the Book Musings Hall of Fame. Now, it didn't quite make the top shelf. Didn't give it an A+. I toyed with that a little bit, but not quite. But it joins, the other entrants so far to the highly coveted Book Musings Hall of Fame, including Animal Farm, which did make the top shelf, 1984, How I Found Freedom in an Unfree World by Harry Brown, and On Writing by Stephen King. Those 4 had previously made the Book Musings Hall of Fame, and so this joins them in the Book Musings Hall of Fame. So those are all A's, this one included. Again, almost really nothing but positives to say about the book and about Terence McKenna himself, at least from what I know of him. So really enjoyed my experience reading Food of the Gods by Terence McKenna. I would highly recommend it to almost everyone. Again, it's a studious academic work that's very well argued and well resourced, but at the same time, I would argue it remains very accessible to the average everyday person. And given what hinges on his theories, and at least if you can believe him, I think it would behoove all of us to give him a chance, right, and to take a look at what he suggests and his theories. All right, so I want to conclude, as I always do, by talking about what might be on tap. So what's on tap here? I think I referenced in the previous episode, so Book Musings episode 11, when I talked about Stephen King's It, that I was, thinking about The Stand, reading or listening to The Stand, and at that point I'd maybe been 1 or 2 or 3 discs in, listening to the audio version or audiobook of The Stand. And now I'm, in fact, more than halfway through it. I've been listening to it on my runs and in the van as we've traveled to and from Colorado on recent vacations. And so I'll have some thoughts on that. That could be a potential episode. And not to say too much about it, but I will say that I have been enjoying The Stand much more than It. What else might be on tap? Well, I was profoundly affected by McKenna's book to the point where I've, looked into his other stuff. I might read one of these other books I have by him, True Hallucinations, The Archaic Revival. These both look pretty interesting. And then in the same sort of vein of Terence McKenna, you have Timothy Leary. A lot of us have probably heard of Timothy Leary. He's more associated with LSD. In the turbulent 60s, studied at Harvard and was a professor there until he got kicked out and so on. But interested in sort of his thoughts and some of the theories he was proffering at the time, and started reading The Psychedelic Experience already by him and Ralph Menser and Richard Alpert Menzner. About almost halfway through that. Been reading that. So, and those were all inspired by, again, reading McKenna's Food of the Gods. Also, I've been watching the Andrew Huberman podcast. So this is something new that I don't think I've ever mentioned on the Book Musings podcast yet, but I stumbled upon him. He teaches at Stanford, and I can't remember his official title, neurobiologist or something like that. But so he's an academic, but then he, free of charge, puts on this podcast where he tries to, educate everyday people about neurobiology, and he talks extensively, for example, on light and the impact of light on our bodies and just how much of a role that has in our everyday feeling of well-being and so on. So anyway, I mentioned this Andrew Huberman because he recommended, I don't even know if there it is. He recommended a book, or he talks about it and doesn't necessarily recommend it, although he probably did, but referenced this book quite often, and it really had me interested. Piqued my interest, and it's a book called The Molecule of More by Daniel Lieberman and Michael Long, so I acquired a copy and might take a look at that. Again, Andrew Huberman podcast, I definitely recommend that. Been focusing on sort of educating myself, again, a lot of the things that he talks about. So check out that if you're interested in that sort of thing. And then I mentioned the book that he referenced quite a bit in a lot of those episodes. I think I've made it through maybe episode 19 so far. So, and a lot of these episodes are an hour and a half long, so I really appreciate what he's doing. He reminds me a lot, I mentioned this to my wife, he reminds me a lot of myself, right? If I were doing a pod, he does the timestamps and all that, very meticulous, in sort of his deep dives and conveying sort of his thoughts. Has a lot of extensive takes on things, and so 3 hours in here you can see how I relate to how he does things. And so a lot of respect for Andrew Huberman and for sort of the recommendation to read The Molecule of More. So that's on my radar. Also had a friend, a good friend of mine, and his dad, who was also a friend of mine, had mentioned in some email correspondence this author that I surprisingly never heard of up to that point, and that's John Brunner, who's written a ton of sci-fi stuff. And we got this friend's dad mentioned how he thought maybe I'd really enjoy his stuff, given some of the things I'd been saying and so on. And so I took a look at John Brunner and some of the plot lines of his works, and they really did seem kind of interesting to me. So mentioning that because I might take a look at and read some of his stuff next. Who knows? I've referenced this in previous episodes. My next sort of academic project is going to be teaching and developing a course on ancient philosophy. And so I've actually really started doing that in earnest this summer. Started working on the lectures and so on. And so a lot of that entails somewhere around here, the ancient, reading up on the ancient philosophy and through these various anthologies. And so I have those anthologies that I'm reading. And then also Will Durant is a pretty respected author within philosophical circles, especially when it comes to, ancient philosophy, but in particular history of philosophy in general. And so I wanted to, in part of preparing for that ancient philosophy course, I wanted to become better versed in, the time and the culture and how things were when ancient philosophy was going on. And by ancient philosophy, we mean philosophy that was going on primarily by males in ancient Greece, during ancient times. So I want to know more about that culture and how things were. And so this is a great resource then. I've just started, but have been enjoying this as well. So anyway, that's a look at what's on the radar, what could turn into possible episodes down the road, and just things I'm reading in general. But that's that. I think it's finally time to draw this episode to a conclusion. I can barely speak now. This might be a record. I think it is a record for the longest episode so far. Who knows what we'll encounter down the road. But I think it's for good reason. I had, as I mentioned, a lot to say. This is a very important book in my mind. Surprisingly, I think neglected work. I cannot believe that it hasn't received more scholarly attention. Or maybe it has, and I'm just unaware of it. That's probably unlikely. Again, you can see all kinds of reviews and summaries of Stephen King's It, but you seldom encounter anything on Food of the Gods by Terence McKenna. In fact, one of the other videos I watched, somebody was offering sort of thoughts on this work, and someone in the comments said, "I've never in my life met anyone else who, read McKenna, who was familiar with McKenna." And so, I feel that same way, and that's I had never really known too much about McKenna or read his stuff until this year myself. So it was a long episode, but hopefully worth it. Hopefully worth your while. Hopefully you enjoyed it and got something out of it. That's it. Until next time, thank you again for joining me for episode 12 of Book Musings, where we discussed everything there is to know and think about with respect to Food of the Gods by Terence McKenna. Thank you.